Robb Stark stood upon the ramparts of Riverrun, cloaked in a gray fur that rippled in the rising wind. The trident ran swift below, a dark ribbon beneath the sky. Men moved with nervous energy in the courtyard, sharpening steel, tending to horses, exchanging uncertain glances as new orders were shouted. The king in the north's eyes were drawn westward, beyond the red walls and flowing waters, where the distant sprawl of the Westerlands promised conflict and, perhaps, fate itself. His mother, Cailin, stood beside him, her face composed but lined with worry. There had been reports from their scouts of Lannister hosts gathering near Harrenhal, of fleets rumored to be moving from Lannisport, and of cracks forming in the precarious alliances that held together the northern cause. He exhaled, wishing that the rustle of leaves in the wind could carry away every regret he harbored. Too many men had died, and the war had only just begun. The vow to avenge his father's execution and to secure the North's freedom weighed heavily on his shoulders. He was aware of how precarious their position was. Though the North and Riverlands were large, they lacked a vital strength at sea. If the Lannisters gained free rein along the coast, even the walls of Riverrun might eventually be choked off from supplies, and the path to the Westerlands would become perilous. Amid these worries, Theon Greyjoy had come forward with a suggestion that glittered with possibility. By his counsel, Robb could forge an alliance with the Ironborn, an unthinkable prospect to many. Theon was, after all, both hostage and ward, taken from Pike when he was but a boy. Hadn't Balon Greyjoy rebelled against the Iron Throne not so long ago, only to be crushed by the might of the realm? Would Balon even consider an alliance with the Starks? Or was Theon's suggestion merely a fleeting dream of forging a new identity for himself and bridging two worlds that had shaped him? Yet Theon had been insistent, cornering Robb in a quiet moment in the solar. With the Iron Fleet, we can sever the Lannisters from their western seas. We can harass every supply line, raid Lannisport, hold the Sunset Sea. Their gold won't buy them anything if their ships are at the bottom of the ocean. Robb had not immediately dismissed him. He weighed the risk. The Ironborn were proud, they were fierce, and they held a certain savage independence that matched the old ways of the North. But they were also prone to betrayal, to follow whatever path led to spoils. It was a gamble, but one worth taking, or so Robb had come to believe. With his mother's counsel, he decided that Theon would cross the seas to Pike and entreat Balon. If Theon could persuade his father that a partnership with the North would bring plunder, independence, and a chance to strike the Lannisters, an old foe, then perhaps the war could shift drastically in Robb's favor. And so, with uneasy blessings, Theon Greyjoy departed, sailing into the mists and the rolling waves. The days passed slowly afterward, each hour a study in tension. Robb found himself pacing in the yard, walking among the tents of his lords, or riding to check the outriders himself, anything to distract him from the looming question. Had Theon succeeded, or was he even still alive? Balon's hostility was legendary, and there was no guarantee that he wouldn't simply kill Theon or hold him hostage, ignoring any idea of alliance. In truth, Robb could only wait. The war ground on, for Tywin Lannister still tested the borders, sending raiding parties and occasionally massing his forces for feints along the river. Still, Riverrun stood firm. The young wolf's reputation for cunning in battle, begun with the victories at Whispering Wood and the Battle of the Camps, continued to keep the Lannisters wary. When a raven arrived bearing the Kraken sigil instead of the flayed man or the lion, the castle was abuzz. Robb hurried to the rookery himself, his mother at his side, Grey Wind pacing at their heels. The black bird bore a scrap of parchment with Theon's hand, describing that Balon Greyjoy had agreed to an alliance, on terms both risky and bold. The Ironborn demanded full rights to the western seas, permission to raid the Lannisters' coasts, and a future promise of independence for the Iron Islands. Should Robb achieve what he desired, the North's own independence from the Iron Throne. "We must do more than declare ourselves kings," the Raven's message read. "We must carve out our kingdoms by steel and by salt." Robb's eyes shone with cautious hope. He summoned his bannermen to council, ignoring their muttered doubts and reservations. Roose Bolton, austere and quiet, merely observed. Ser Brynden Blackfish Tully looked ready to protest, but then held his tongue. possibly envisioning the strategic advantages that a naval alliance might offer. Great John Umber pounded his fist, half enthusiastic, half skeptical. Lady Cailin spoke in measured tones, reminding them that while the Greyjoys were notorious for their independence and brutality, the weight of the Lannisters was too great to shoulder alone. "We must consider every advantage," she cautioned. "Our men are valiant, but steel alone will not keep the Lannisters' ships from blockading the western coasts." Word was soon sent back. The king in the north would cement the alliance, though the final details would be hammered out in negotiation upon Balon's own shores. Reluctantly, Robb prepared to travel, taking a carefully chosen retinue to Pike. When the day arrived to set out, the gates of Riverrun opened wide, and a small host of Northmen and Riverlanders moved out, outriders ahead, banners snapping in the wind. Robb felt the weight of a new chapter in this war. He could almost sense how the events of the coming weeks would reshape everything, be it for triumph or downfall. The journey to the coast was somber and tense. The party was small enough to avoid easy detection, but large enough to show that the king in the north did not come as a beggar. They reached Seaguard after weeks of careful travel, passing roads that were still scorched from Lannister raids. The sight of blackened farms and villages weighed on them, a grim reminder that the war was far from decided. At Seaguard, they found ships bearing the Grey Direwolf and the Kraken side by side. This was Theon's doing, somehow persuading his sister Asha, whom the mainlands would continue to call Yara, to bring a small detachment to ferry Robb's retinue to Pike. Theon, waiting upon the docks with that same half-smirk he often wore, greeted Robb with arms wide. While some among Robb's men pressed hands to sword hilts, regarding the Ironborn with suspicion, Robb clasped Theon's forearm as though he were a brother. "You did it," he said quietly, unable to conceal his relief. Theon grinned, though his eyes flickered with some mixture of pride and doubt. "Come and see," was all Theon said, leading Robb and his guard aboard the longships. Their sails bore the Kraken sigil, and the deck was manned by reavers whose eyes gleamed like cold steel. The smell of salt and tar invaded the nostrils. Robb felt Grey Wind's agitation by his side. The direwolf sniffed and growled softly, uncertain of these rocking planks and the throng of men he did not know. Yet the crossing to Pike went without incident, though the seas restless might battered them with swells. Robb stood at the prow, letting the spray wash across his face. If this alliance was to hold, if the Ironborn truly committed themselves to strangling the Lannisters at sea, the entire shape of the war could change. And if not, then he was sailing into the jaws of a kraken that would surely devour him. Pike came into view in the early dawn, gray towers perched upon jagged rocks, the sea foaming hungrily below the causeways. Gull cries echoed in the sky, a harsh and lonely sound. The wind carried the tang of brine, and the tide swirled ominously around the spires. Balon Greyjoy awaited them in the great keep, a man aged by years of rebellion and defeat, his stern countenance marked by the bitterness of a lost war. When Robb walked into the hall, dressed in plain leather and furs befitting a northerner, the eyes of the Ironborn followed him with calculating interest. Balon greeted him not with warmth, but with a rigid courtesy. "King in the north," he said, as if tasting the title on his tongue. "It seems every corner of Westeros has a king these days." He gestured for Robb to sit. There was little ceremony. The great keep smelled of salt and damp stone. Tapestries of krakens in black and gold hung from the walls. The Ironborn lords and attendants stood in silent ranks, among them Dagmar Cleftjaw, who eyed Robb with curiosity, and Asha Greyjoy, who leaned on her sword pommel, measuring the northern visitors. In plain words, the alliance was laid out. Balon demanded freedom to raid the Westerlands unimpeded, and wanted strong assurances that when the North won its freedom, the Iron Islands would be recognized as an independent kingdom as well, no longer bound by the Iron Throne of King's Landing. Robb listened, considering the demands. Many of them matched Theon's earlier message, though hearing them in Balon's grim tone lent them a certain weight. Robb answered with caution, explaining that he did not see the Iron Throne as holding any legitimate rule over the North, and he would be willing to recognize the independence of the Iron Islands if they helped defeat the Lannisters. There were barbed questions, What of the Riverlands sworn to the Tullus and, by extension, to the king in the north? Balon scoffed that rivers should not hamper the ships of the Ironborn. Robb had to walk a political tightrope. He could not cede the Riverlands to Ironborn raids, for that would betray the Tullus and sow immediate discord. So with measured words, he told Balon that the alliance was aimed at one target, the Lannisters and their coastal holdings. Any raids upon the Riverlands would break the pact. Still, Balon pressed, pushing Robb to see how much he would bend, reminding him that the old ways permitted the Ironborn to pay the iron price. Robb, in turn, insisted that the iron price be paid in Lannister gold alone. The tension in the air was palpable. In the end, after a night of negotiations carried out in a salt-slick hall with torches that hissed in the damp, the alliance was struck. Robb rose from the table, clasped Balon's forearm, and swore before the drowned god's statue that the North and the Iron Islands would stand together against the Lannisters, that each would have its independence from the Iron Throne, and that they would respect each other's domains. Balon's eyes glittered with a harsh satisfaction. Asha nodded approvingly, while Theon looked relieved, though a strange weight remained in his gaze, as though he wondered where he truly belonged in this new scheme. That very night, bonfires burned along the iron shores, as reavers prepared their longships for war. Robb dined with Balon and the Lords of Pike, a meager feast by some southern standards. But for the Ironborn it was enough to roast fish and drink sour ale. Robb's men slept in the corners of the keep or aboard their ships, uneasy but resolved. Come morning, the plan was to be set in motion. The Iron Fleet would sail en masse for the coasts of the Westerlands, while Robb would march south with his host, drawing Tywin's forces into pitched battles, preventing them from relieving their coastal strongholds. The Lannisters, squeezed from land and sea, would find their coffers draining faster than they could fill them, their supply lines severed, their trade strangled. In time, perhaps, they would be forced to yield, or at least be weakened enough that a decisive blow could be struck. Robb remained on Pike only 2 days more, forging personal bonds with certain captains, offering gold, forging friendships, or something akin to them, through shared toasts. He recognized that the Ironborn respected strength above all, and so he did not flinch from their rough jests or their pointed questions about whether the Wolf King had the stomach to wage a true war. He answered them calmly, though inside he wondered if he was venturing down a dangerous path with men who might become future enemies. But that was a concern for another day. The war demanded risk or it would be lost. When Robb departed Pike, Theon decided to remain with the Ironborn, insisting that he could best help coordinate the naval campaign. Robb allowed it, though something in him felt the pang of losing an old friend and foster brother to a world as harsh and unforgiving as the Iron Islands. He trusted Theon's word and prayed it would be enough. Grey wind pawed the planks of the gangway as they disembarked, a low growl rumbling in his throat. Once again, Robb and his retinue returned to Riverrun, stopping briefly at Seaguard to check on the readiness of the small fleet he would keep in the northern river ports. Upon arrival at Riverrun, the castle guards greeted them with reserved cheers, for they had seen no reason to believe that the war had suddenly turned in their favor. Still, Robb wasted no time. Messages were sent to his bannermen to muster anew, to prepare for a fresh campaign. They would move against Tywin's forces near the Golden Tooth, perhaps strike at any Lannister detachments in the Riverlands, while the Ironborn hammered their coasts from the sea. It started unexpectedly quickly. Within a fortnight of Robb's return, the first reports arrived. Ironborn longships had seized Lannisport in a surprise raid. They had burned a handful of merchant vessels, sacked the warehouses of their supplies, and even captured a small Lannister coastal galley. Word spread that the Kraken banners were flying brazenly within sight of Casterly Rock's high vantage. Soldiers were mustered in haste by the Lannisters, but the Ironborn vanished back to sea before their arrival, leaving only ash and fear. The blow was shocking. No one in the Westerlands had expected such a swift assault on a place considered relatively safe. Next came another blow. Lady Cersei had been funneling gold and resources from the Crown's treasury to support the Lannister armies. But with the Ironborn rampaging along the western coasts, many ships carrying gold, men, and supplies had either been sunk or forced to turn back. The cost was immense, and rumors trickled throughout the realm that the crown's coffers were running dangerously low. Tywin Lannister, furious, began repositioning his forces, trying to guard not only the landward approach but the vulnerable coastline as well. Instead of pressing an attack deep into the riverlands, he ordered certain regiments to the seaside. Robb saw his opportunity and took it. Calling upon the Lords of the Trident, he led a swift march toward Harrenhal, not to storm that cursed fortress but to challenge and divert the Lannisters, forcing them into field battles rather than let them pin him against the walls of some castle. The Great John, Roose Bolton, and other bannermen marched in columns, morale bolstered by news of Ironborn successes. There were scattered skirmishes in open fields, crossing swords with lesser Lannister bannermen who were ill-prepared for a large host. Fleeing peasants offered conflicting reports of Tywin's whereabouts, but eventually, reliable scouts ascertained that Tywin was stationed near the crossroads, uncertain of where Robb intended to strike next. One moonlit night, as the combined northern and riverland forces set their camps in the rolling countryside near the Red Fork, a messenger from Balon Greyjoy arrived under the cover of darkness. A scarred man with salt in his beard, he brought news that the Iron Fleet was massing near Fair Isle, cutting off the Lannisters' shipping routes entirely. Lord Balon bids me say, the seas belong to the Kraken now. The old ways have returned. Robb found himself unable to conceal a fierce grin at that. He pored over his maps with the Blackfish and Roose Bolton by candlelight, concluding that Tywin would be forced to respond to the coastal threat or risk losing not just Lannisport but the entire western domain. This meant Tywin could not bring his full might against Robb, an advantage the king in the north could exploit. And exploit it he did. Setting out from the Red Fork, Robb maneuvered his forces, leading the Lannisters into a series of engagements where they could never commit fully. At the Battle of Ashford Fields, a modest conflict compared to some of the war's earlier clashes, Robb's cavalry circled the Lannister flank. Though the Lannister forces were not entirely routed, they were forced to withdraw with heavier casualties. Robb's men cheered as they recovered horses, arms, and even some precious supply wagons. In each victory, small though they might have been, the northern cause grew stronger, while the Lannisters stretched themselves thinner. Far to the west, the Ironborn were not idle. Reports arrived of Asha Greyjoy herself landing raiding parties near Case, sacking the port, capturing minor Lannister bannermen, and slaying any who resisted. She and Theon had guided their men with startling efficiency, employing the cunning of the sea. Using the chaos, they seized gold and supplies from the Lannisters for themselves. Pike, once a battered kingdom after Balon's failed rebellion, was now flush with plunder. But for all that, Balon showed no signs of betraying the pact with the North. Indeed, the Ironborn relished smashing the Westerlands, a region known for wealth and pride, and the more success they found, the more eager they were to continue. In King's Landing, Queen Regent Cersei and her advisors seethed. No matter what they attempted, loan requests from the Iron Bank, appeals to other lords, or mustering a royal fleet from the Crownlands, there was simply not enough time or resources to mount an effective counter at sea. The royal fleet was hardly large to begin with, and many ships had been left in disrepair or devoted to the War of the Five Kings on other fronts. Some captains refused to sail west, citing the rumored presence of hundreds of Ironborn longships. Cersei's frustration mounted, and she demanded that Tywin deal with the threat. But Tywin was pinned between the necessity of defending the West from the Iron Fleet and containing Robb Stark's army in the Riverlands. Jaime Lannister was still imprisoned in Riverrun's dungeons. That, too, weighed heavily on the Lannisters. They could not abandon hope of rescuing Jaime, but to do that, they needed men and a strong offense. Time passed, each side maneuvering. Winter was not yet upon them, but the winds began to turn colder. Robb decided to press the advantage. He marched swiftly toward the Golden Tooth, capturing the fortress there after a short but intense siege. The news traveled quickly. The Lannisters had lost their key stronghold that guarded the passes into the Westerlands. For Robb, the gateway was open. He assembled his forces to cross into Lannister territory, to threaten the very seat of their power. Some of his bannermen trembled at the thought. The Westerlands were a wealthy place, with numerous lesser lords who could rally. Still, many were battered by the Ironborn already. If Robb struck boldly, he might convince them to yield, or at least remain neutral, lest they draw the wolves and the krakens further onto their land. At first, progress was slow. Robb's outriders reported that Tywin Lannister, angered by the fall of the Golden Tooth, was assembling a significant army to block Robb's invasion, ordering other forces to keep the coasts from descending entirely into chaos. The Lannisters, after all, were formidable even under pressure. Robb's host took the fortress of Cornfield after a brief gag. Many of the local lords had pulled back, uncertain if reinforcements would come. The northern men were both exultant and apprehensive, for they now stood in the midst of Lannister territory. The gold mines that dotted the region were left deserted, or so it seemed. The villagers they encountered had little love for the Iron Throne, but also no love for invaders. Still, Robb's men tried to keep discipline, to avoid the rapine and pillage that so often accompanied war. They needed the local populace to cooperate, or at least not rise against them in large numbers. In the meantime, the Ironborn tightened their grip at sea. From the Bay of Ice down to the waters off the Westerlands, their longships prowled relentlessly. Theon and Asha launched raids with a certain pattern. They would appear at dawn or dusk, overwhelming small Lannister garrisons, seizing or burning ships in harbors, and then departing before a response could be mustered. The Lannisters attempted to station archers and scorpions along the coastline, but they never knew where the Ironborn would strike next. Each day the tension grew. House Lannister still had gold, but it was locked beneath their feet in unreachable mines, or else stuck in Casterly Rock's vaults. Tywin found himself unable to buy the Sellsword companies in the numbers he might have desired, for the Ironborn threatened any ships that might bring them across. As the tension built, Tywin made a move. He left a portion of his forces to keep Harrenhal and the other strongholds secure, then marched west himself, determined to confront Robb Stark head-on. This resulted in the clash known thereafter as the Battle of the Tumblestone. On a mist-shrouded morning, Robb's outriders reported Lannister banners in the distance. The northern host took position on a low ridge near the river, forming ranks under the direction of Roose Bolton and the Blackfish. Tywin's presence was unmistakable. Twin lion standards, a shining host of heavy cavalry, infantry in polished armor. The grass was wet with dew. Gray wind paced at Robb's side, ears flat against his head. Combat erupted at midday, the clang of steel echoing as cavalry charged across muddy fields. Arrows rained from both sides. Tywin's knights battered against the northern lines, but Robb had carefully placed sharpened stakes and ditches, forcing the Lannister horse to wheel around. The Great John led a ferocious countercharge, howling the Stark war cry. On the flanks, Bolton's men crept through the haze, quietly turning a Lannister unit into disarray with a surprise attack. For hours, the battle surged back and forth. Tywin himself was said to have led a contingent of heavy horse, seeking to break the northern center. But Robb's men held, their resolve hardened by the knowledge that they had allies at sea wreaking havoc on their foe. By dusk, the Lannisters had inflicted serious losses on the Northerners, but they, too, bled. Then word reached Tywin's camp that the Ironborn had assaulted a major supply train bound for his army. They burned wagons, sank a flotilla carrying provisions, and left Tywin's men with little recourse. Faced with the reality of a prolonged fight without supplies, Tywin made the bitter decision to pull back under cover of darkness. The next morning, Robb's scouts discovered the Lannister camp nearly empty, the banners gone. Though exhausted and bloodied, the North had held. That victory resonated through the realm, making the name of the young wolf even more feared. Tales spread that he had reached an alliance with the Kraken, that the sea and the land alike bent to him. Though that was certainly an exaggeration, it spooked potential allies of the Lannisters and made some uncommitted houses reconsider their loyalties. Balon Greyjoy, naturally, took advantage of the chaos. He sent raiders farther and farther south, occasionally clashing with the Redwyne fleet from the Reach, which had been called upon to assist in the war. But the Redwyne's priority was protecting the Tyrell coast and the Arbor, not sailing all the way around Westeros to defend the Westerlands. The Iron Fleet, thus, was rarely challenged in open waters. The sea battles were fierce. Ironborn reavers fought like cornered wolves, swarming enemy decks with axes and cutlasses. On more than one occasion, small Lannister galleys were captured and repurposed. Robb, meanwhile, advanced further into the Westerlands. Town after town surrendered rather than face the horrors of war, as the local lords realized that House Lannister was struggling to feed its own armies and defend its own coasts. The wide plains became contested territory, with northern outriders skirmishing with Lannister horsemen, who were constantly forced to check Robb's movement. Winterfell was far behind Robb, but in his heart, he carried the north with him, and all that remained at stake. He carried the memory of his father, beheaded in King's Landing, and the promise that the Lannisters would pay for their treachery. Catelyn Stark rode with him often, though she pleaded for him to search for a way to end the war quickly. She worried about Sansa, still a captive at King's Landing, and about Arya, whose whereabouts were unknown. Robb understood her anguish, but he saw no straightforward path to retrieve his sisters. King's Landing was too distant, too well guarded. The best way to free them, he believed, was to force a surrender or to exchange Jaime for them. Jaime still languished under guard in Riverrun. But first, he had to weaken the Lannisters enough that they would accept such a trade. That weakening continued to be the Ironborn's gift. Each day, ravens arrived bearing more news of Lannister shipping going up in flames, of coastal towns being sacked, of men who refused to board ships with Lannister sails for fear of the Kraken. While Cersei and the royal court did their best to preserve the illusion of the crown's strength, the truth was that House Lannister's resources were hemorrhaging at a terrifying rate. Gold alone could not buy victory without the means to transport it and distribute it. Matters came to a head when Robb's army approached the outskirts of Lannisport itself. Great walls, stout gates, and the protective shadow of Casterly rock loomed. Tywin's diminished forces had massed there, well aware that if Lannisport fell, so too would the main seat of House Lannister's power on the coast. The city was not lightly defended, but the presence of the Iron Fleet off the coast, blockading the port, meant that no relief could come by sea. The siege began. Northern camps ringed the landward side. Ironborn ships bobbed on the waves just beyond the city's harbor. Theon Greyjoy himself was said to be among them, scanning the city's walls with hungry eyes. The siege of Lannisport lasted weeks, with archers on both sides trading volleys. The defenders were determined, for they recognized that surrender meant losing the seat of the Lannister navy, meager though it now was, and a symbolic stronghold of their might. Robb sought to press the matter quickly, ordering his best engineers and sappers to undermine the walls. The Ironborn launched coordinated raids at night, forcing the defenders to split their attention. Tywin Lannister, inside, refused to yield. He scoured the city for extra defenders, fortifying gates and walls. Yet little by little, the cracks began to show. The city's food stores dwindled without resupply. The small port defenders who attempted to break the blockade were swiftly chased back by Ironborn reavers. During this time, a letter arrived in Robb's camp bearing the seal of King's Landing. Inside were demands: release Jaime Lannister immediately, and perhaps the crown would show mercy. Robb's anger flared. He replied with a curt message that if his sisters were returned, unharmed, and if the crown recognized the North and the Iron Islands as free kingdoms, then discussions could begin. He doubted Cersei would agree, but it laid the terms bare. The war was no longer about intangible loyalties or complicated oaths. It was about independence from a throne that had shown itself to be treacherous. Then something unexpected happened. A smaller Lannister force, commanded by Kevan Lannister, attempted a breakout from the city. Under cover of darkness, they sallied from a postern gate, hoping to smash a gap in the northern lines and flee to gather help from further inland. They came close to success, but Robb's scouts caught wind of the plan just in time. A savage nighttime skirmish ensued. Campfires cast dancing shadows on the battlefield as men hacked at each other in the dark. Gray wind, prowling the perimeter, leapt upon more than one would-be escapee, the direwolf's teeth flashing red. The attempt ended in failure. Kevan and a fraction of his men fought their way free, but they fled in disarray. The city's defenders lost precious men, and Tywin's face grew grimmer still as dawn revealed the extent of the losses. In the Iron Fleet's blockade, Asha Greyjoy spied the city's gates. She discussed with Theon the possibility of launching a direct naval assault in tandem with a land push. Theon, seizing the moment, took command of a few longships, slipping close to the harbor at night, trying to find any weaknesses in the chain booms that protected the harbor mouth. Such an attack was dangerous. Coastal catapults, scorpions, and arrow slits could rake them with fire, but if the blockade could breach the harbor, it might break the city's ability to defend itself from both sides. In the days that followed, the city reeled under constant pressure. Tunnels snaked under the walls, and portions began to collapse, sending rubble and defenders tumbling. It was heartbreakingly violent and relentless. Tywin Lannister did everything he could, but with no relief forthcoming, supplies nearly gone, and the city's morale flagging, Lannisport's defenders started to discuss the unthinkable: surrender. Rumors circulated that the gold in the rock was worthless if they all starved. Tywin, proud and unyielding, sought to discipline any talk of surrender, threatening to hang any man who dared speak of it. But desperation has its own logic. Finally, the day arrived. Early one morning, as a pale sun lifted above the harbor, a portion of the walls collapsed with a thunderous roar. It was a sabotage effort orchestrated by Robb's sappers. Northern trumpets blared. The men rushed forward through the gap, led by the Great John and flanked by Bolton's infantry. The fighting in the breach was savage, a swirl of swords, pikes, and screams. Robb's banners advanced methodically, pressing defenders back. At the same moment, a portion of the Ironborn ships took advantage of the chaos to attack from the harbor. While they did not land in large numbers, the threat from behind forced some defenders to split off, leaving Tywin's lines dangerously thin. In the end, the day's slaughter ended with the city gates thrown open. Robb Stark entered Lannisport amidst the clangor of battered men and the stench of smoke. Tywin Lannister was nowhere to be found. He had retreated to Casterly Rock with his most loyal retinue, determined to hold the rock or die trying. Robb allowed his men to occupy the city, though he insisted on discipline and an end to wanton killing or looting. He knew the Ironborn had no such qualms, but Balon's agreement with him technically constrained them from taking unrestrained spoils from the newly conquered territory. That did not fully stop the Greyjoy Reavers, who took what they could from the harbor. Still, the presence of the northern host in the city forced them to keep some semblance of control. With Lannisport secured, Robb turned his attention to the imposing shape of Casterly Rock towering over the coastline. The seat of House Lannister was a formidable fortress, carved into the very rock face. Taking it by force would be a monumental challenge, more difficult even than Lannisport. Yet if Robb could corner Tywin within those walls, perhaps the war could be ended. The Iron Fleet still prowled the seas, preventing any attempt at escape or resupply by water. Robb established a siege line on land, though he knew that a direct assault might cost him dearly. The rock was so large and so cunningly engineered that it could withstand armies for a long time. However, the Lannisters within faced the same problem as in Lannisport. No supplies were coming in, and gold could not feed a man. Over the weeks that followed, the siege turned into a grim stalemate. Robb considered how to expedite the process. He knew that every day spent camped outside Casterly Rock was another day in which the realm's other powers, whether Stannis Baratheon in Dragonstone, Renly in the Reach, or even the remnants of Joffrey's reign in King's Landing, could maneuver. Yet the possibility of capturing Tywin Lannister was too tempting to dismiss, especially since it could force a negotiation to recover Sansa and Arya. The Ironborn, for their part, were growing restless. They had tasted enough plunder to satisfy them for a time, but the old ways demanded that they keep raiding, keep conquering. Balon himself had recused his forces from direct engagement with Robb's siege, preferring to remain at sea or in coastal fortresses they had seized. That might have been for the best, for Robb did not entirely trust them as bedfellows in a land campaign. Thus, the lines hardened. Tywin inside the rock, Robb outside it, the Iron Fleet circling like vultures over the waves. Messengers came and went. Cailin urged a solution that did not require storming the fortress. She pleaded that perhaps a trade could be brokered. Jaime for peace terms, for the release of Robb's sisters, for the recognition of northern independence. But Tywin would not yield so easily, especially while the memory of his losses burned in his mind. If House Lannister fell here, all of Westeros might be shaped anew. One day, a small party of riders approached Robb's camp under a flag of truce. They bore a white banner with a golden lion. Robb emerged to meet them, flanked by the Great John, Roose Bolton, and a handful of guards. The riders claimed to speak for Tywin, who, though proud, recognized the dire straits they faced. The party hinted that perhaps a treaty could be reached, one that would release Jaime, secure the Rock, and withdraw the northern host. In return, Sansa would be released, a large ransom would be paid, and the crown would consider granting the North a measure of autonomy. Conspicuously missing from the terms was any mention of the Iron Islands. Robb pressed them on this, but the riders merely shrugged. Tywin, they said, had no intention of permitting Balon Greyjoy to keep any spoils or independence that he thought rightful Lannister territory. That set Robb's teeth on edge. The entire success of the war thus far hinged on the Ironborn's naval power. If he cast them aside now, that would be a betrayal of the alliance, and the Ironborn would likely turn against him next. He dismissed the riders, telling them to bring back a better offer, one that recognized both the North and the Iron Islands as free of the Iron Throne. The riders left, but their sullen faces did not inspire hope. Meanwhile, tensions between Robb's men and the Ironborn flared. Some of the reavers who lingered near Lannisport boasted about taking thralls, about reaving not just the Lannisters but any who stood before them. Robb's bannermen, proud and honorable in their own way, found these ways abhorrent. In one heated encounter, a group of Bolton men clashed with Ironborn raiders over a cart of goods. 2 were killed before cooler heads intervened. Robb realized that such incidents could easily spiral into open conflict, fracturing the precarious alliance. He ordered his men to hold their tempers, but as the siege wore on, the tension grew. Across Westeros, rumor and speculation abounded. Some wondered if the king in the north was about to topple the mighty House Lannister once and for all. Others whispered that the Ironborn might betray their new allies if the spoils stopped flowing. King's Landing muttered about sending an army west, but the crown was overextended as it was, trying to maintain control in the Stormlands and fend off Stannis. Renly's defeat at the hands of shadowy sorcery, or so rumor claimed, had left the Tyrells in a curious position, allied to the Lannisters by a hasty marriage arrangement to King Joffrey. But Margaery Tyrell's union had not yet had time to bring the full might of the Reach to bear in the west. The roads were long, and the Tyrell lords had to think carefully if they wanted to pit themselves against a Wolf-Kraken alliance in the Westerlands. Time dragged on. Food in the siege camps was not abundant. Cold rains began to pour, soaking tents and threatening disease. Some of Robb's commanders pushed for a direct assault, no matter the cost. Others advised waiting the Lannisters out, starving them until they surrendered. Robb dreaded the idea of throwing thousands of lives at the Rock's impenetrable walls, but winter loomed in the not-too-distant future. He also fretted over the safety of the North itself. The Iron Islands might be an ally now, but how long would that last if the Ironborn grew bored or resentful? Who else might be eyeing the North while its main host was so far south? Then came a stroke of fortune or misfortune for the Lannisters. Deep beneath Casterly Rock, in the labyrinthine mines, a structural failure occurred. Whether it was sabotage by the sappers or simply the result of overmining, a massive collapse took place in the depths, shaking the fortress above. Part of the west wall fell away, leaving a gaping scar in the rock. Panic spread among the defenders. As new passages opened, dust choked the corridors, and the entire fortress threatened further collapses. Word reached Robb's camp by defectors who slipped out in the chaos. Sensing opportunity, Robb ordered his men to prepare for a swift assault on that compromised section of the fortress. Scaling ladders, ropes, everything they could muster, the morning dawned with a blood-red sun, as if the gods knew the violence that was about to unfold. Northern drums thundered, horns blew. Men rushed forward through the rubble, pushing at the half-formed breach, while archers loosed volley after volley to suppress defenders on the ramparts. Tywin's men fought like cornered lions. They poured boiling oil, unleashed arrow storms, and lunged from behind collapsed stones. But the collapse had fundamentally weakened their defensive posture. In the confusion, some bands of Ironborn, eager for glory and riches, joined the assault from the shoreline, clambering up rocky ledges near the sea caves. The clash was chaotic. Men fell screaming to their deaths on jagged rocks. Ladders were toppled. The wounded cried for help or for their mothers. Amid the tumult, Robb Stark urged his men on, his sword red with Lannister blood. He tried to maintain order, but warfare is rarely a neat affair. Bit by bit, the northern men and their allies gained ground, breaching the outer corridors, pushing deeper into the fortress. They encountered corridors lit by flickering torches, tapestries of golden lions slashed to ribbons. In one hall, Great Jon Umber bellowed as he led a surge, scattering Lannister defenders. The battle spilled into feasting halls, bedchambers, storerooms. Smoke drifted in from the collapsed mines below. At last, the fighting reached the grand hall of Casterly Rock. Tywin Lannister stood there, regal even amid the dust and ruin, his gold armor tarnished by soot. He was flanked by red-cloaked guards with fierce eyes. For a moment, the clangor of steel and the screams of men receded, as if the sight of Tywin froze the world. Then the fighting resumed with new fervor. Robb's bannermen pressed forward. Tywin fought calmly, methodically, each strike carefully placed. A small ring of bodies formed around him. Yet the defenders were heavily outnumbered, battered by weeks of siege. One by one they fell until Tywin stood alone, panting, his sword still raised. Robb, face grim, approached. Blood trickled from a shallow cut on his forehead. He looked upon the man who had orchestrated the downfall of his father, though Joffrey had administered the final blow. This was the moment for which many of his men had fought and died. Tywin stared at him with cold, green eyes, unflinching. "Well, boy," he said quietly, his voice echoing in the vast hall. "Here we are." A hush fell over the chamber, broken only by distant cries from elsewhere in the fortress. Theon Greyjoy, clothes tattered from battle, entered behind Robb, panting. Ironborn reavers lurked at the edges, eyeing the golden decor, the possibility of loot. The Great Jon stood, sword dripping with gore, while Roose Bolton adjusted his gloves, ever composed. Robb's voice was hard. "Yield, Lord Tywin. It's over." Tywin gave a half-sneer. "For now, Stark, but know that victory is fleeting. Honor is no shield against the realm's memory." He paused, as though weighing whether to strike one last time or to accept the inevitable. His eyes flickered to the ring of steel around him, to the archers notched and ready, to the enormous direwolf snarling a short distance away. Slowly, he let the sword drop from his hand. It clanged upon the floor. The last lion of the West had yielded. In the hours that followed, the halls of Casterly Rock were secured. The Ironborn gleefully scoured the chambers for gold trinkets, though Robb sternly forbade wanton destruction. Tywin was placed under guard, his face an unreadable mask of disdain. Soldiers and small folk who had survived the siege were disarmed and gathered in the courtyard, forced to yield to the king in the north. Messengers were dispatched to spread word of the fall of Casterly Rock. All through the corridors, men stared in disbelief at the gray direwolf banner placed side by side with the black kraken, fluttering from parapets that had once borne only the golden lion. In the aftermath, negotiations began in earnest. Robb sent word immediately to King's Landing. They had captured Tywin Lannister and taken the seat of House Lannister. This was the time to bargain for the release of his sisters, for the official recognition of Northern and Iron Islands' independence. He demanded terms that would see Sansa safely returned, Arya, if she could be found, and a significant portion of the Lannister treasury offered as restitution for the war. More importantly, the North and the Iron Islands were to be declared sovereign realms, separate from the Iron Throne. Cersei Lannister's response came, filled with fury and denial. She threatened that if Tywin was harmed, Sansa would pay with her life. The tension soared again. Robb realized that though he had captured the heart of the West, his sister still hung in the balance. He met with Theon, with Asha, with his own advisors, trying to piece together a plan to force Cersei's hand. Tywin, for his part, advised that if any harm came to him, House Lannister would devote its every breath to vengeance, no matter who sat the Iron Throne. Cold stares were exchanged in the newly seized war room, once Tywin's private domain. But the reality was harsh for Cersei as well. With Tywin captive, the West in chaos, and the Iron Fleet dominating the seas, House Lannister's power had never been so compromised. The crown might have allies in the Tyrells, but the Tyrells had their own interests to look after, and shipping anything to the Westerlands without incurring the Iron Fleet's wrath was a fool's errand. A protracted war would only bleed the crown further, especially as winter threatened. The realm's merchants whispered that a famine could be near if shipping lanes remained blocked. Amid these negotiations, Balon Greyjoy arrived in Lannisport, escorted by a proud retinue of reavers. He was hailed by his men as the King of the Isles and the North, a title he used since the Greyjoy Rebellion, though Robb only formally recognized him as the King of the Iron Islands. The tension in that meeting was thick. Balon strode through the halls of Casterly Rock, gazing at the lion carvings with a dark satisfaction, proclaiming that the old ways had been vindicated. Robb remained wary, uncertain how Balon might next try to exploit the situation. The Ironborn had done much to help secure victory, and they demanded their share of the spoils. And so, before the eyes of assembled lords and warrior chiefs, an accord was hammered out. Robb granted the Ironborn dominion over certain coastal regions they had seized, minor port towns in the Westerlands that were now under the Kraken banner, and recognized their independence from the Iron Throne. In return, Balon swore that his men would not raid the Riverlands or the North, and that once a treaty with the Crown was signed, they would not provoke further wars without cause. Theon aided in these talks, trying to smooth the rough edges between his father and his friend. The arrangement was precarious, balanced on the iron edge of mutual gain. Finally, pressured on every side by the new order, King's Landing was compelled to relent. Messengers of the Crown arrived, offering to exchange Sansa for Tywin Lannister, along with a treaty recognizing the North's independence under King Robb Stark, and the Iron Islands as a separate kingdom under Balon Greyjoy. Arya's whereabouts remained uncertain. Some whispered she was still alive, roaming the countryside, but no one could confirm. Though it pained Cailin to leave her younger daughter's fate unresolved, it seemed the realm was pulling them toward a tenuous peace. In the Grand Hall of Casterly Rock, the terms were finally declared. Robb Stark, King in the North, stood in furs and leather, Grey Wind at his side. Balon Greyjoy, King of the Iron Islands, wore salt-stained robes, a driftwood crown perched upon his brow. Tywin Lannister was presented, a prisoner but unbowed, forced to give his acceptance of the treaty on behalf of House Lannister. The arrogance in his gaze never faltered, yet the war had been lost, and so he spoke the words that would shape the new reality of Westeros. The Crown's delegation affirmed that Joffrey Baratheon, though few believed he was truly a Baratheon, conceded to the independence of the North and the Iron Islands, in exchange for Tywin's release and Sansa's safe return. Moreover, the war in the Westerlands would end. Hostilities would cease, and the Lannisters retained the Rock, though much diminished and impoverished. The siege was lifted, the Ironborn would withdraw their blockade in time, and the northern host would depart Lannisport. And so, in a solemn ceremony, Sansa Stark was brought forth. Pale and trembling, she rushed into her mother's arms. Robb felt a rush of relief mingled with sorrow that Arya was still missing. But the moment was bittersweet. They had achieved a measure of victory, vengeance for Ned Stark's execution, and had struck a blow from which House Lannister might never fully recover. They had also redrawn the map of Westeros, forging two new kingdoms in the North and the Iron Islands, casting doubt upon the Iron Throne's strength. In the days that followed, Tywin was released, but not before Robb extracted a solemn oath that the Lannisters would not seek to resume hostilities. Whether that oath would hold once Tywin regained his power was anyone's guess, but for the moment, the realm teetered on the brink of a new peace. The Ironborn withdrew most of their fleet from the Westerlands, though some lingered to oversee their newly claimed ports. Balon departed with his men, the salt breeze carrying them home in triumph. Robb ordered his banners to prepare for a long march back to the north, carrying with them the spoils of victory and the scars of war. And so it was that the question was answered: what if Robb Stark had secured a naval alliance with the Ironborn, choking the Lannisters at sea? The war had been shorter, yet more decisive, for the Lannisters had no recourse against the combined might of northern steel and Ironborn sails. Their supply lines were severed, their gold meaningless without the ships to transport and trade. One by one, their strongholds were besieged or raided, culminating in the fall of Lannisport and the siege of Casterly Rock. Though the victory had been stained with blood and marked by uneasy dealings with the Ironborn, it led to a reshaping of the Seven Kingdoms, with two new kingdoms sundered from the Iron Throne. Kingdoms that might one day turn their swords against each other, but for now found common cause in the memory of the lion's roar brought low. As Robb and his host marched northward, a chill wind whispered through the fields and hills of the Westerlands. Ahead of him lay the uncertain future, the responsibilities of kingship, and the joys and pains of returning home with Sansa, while still bereft of Arya. And behind him, in the battered ruin of Casterly Rock, Tywin Lannister nursed his humiliation, plotting and planning as was his wont. The seeds of vengeance might have been planted anew, but for the moment, the wolf and the kraken had triumphed, and the lion lay wounded in its den. At Moat Cailin, Robb halted his men for a time, gathering news of the north. His mother prayed in the quiet of the gods' wood. Sansa tried to adjust to a freedom that felt both wondrous and fragile. Ravens arrived from Balon Greyjoy, boasting of further raids and conquests, demanding again that Robb make good on his promise to leave the Iron Islands to their own devices. Robb penned back a curt reply, reminding Balon that they were allies and that the agreement stood. Indeed, the king in the north had no desire to provoke the Ironborn further. They had served their use, and he only hoped that they would keep their ambitions from leading them against the north. Yet, as the leaves turned and the cold winds hinted at the winter to come, Robb Stark felt a sense of grim satisfaction. His father was avenged, the Lannisters humbled, and the north, his north, was free. Even if the cost had been enormous and the future uncertain, for that moment, he allowed himself a rare feeling of triumph. The direwolf had run with the kraken, and the lion had been brought to heel. Sometimes, he reflected, alliances were forged between the unlikeliest of partners, and in that alliance, the shape of the realm changed forever. So ended the War of the Five Kings, or at least the western theater of it, under the weight of the sea's fury and the north's wrath. King Robb's name was sung in the halls of Winterfell, praised by the lords of the Trident who owed him fealty, and whispered among peasants who admired his cunning and prowess. Balon's name was cursed by Lannister men and lauded by the Ironborn. It was said that never again would the West dismiss the might of those who ruled the waves. And somewhere in the scattered corners of the Seven Kingdoms, other forces stirred. Stannis brooded on his black throne in Dragonstone, Daenerys Targaryen nursed dragonfire far across the sea, and the White Walkers lurked in the distant reaches beyond the wall. The seeds of future chaos were sown, for wars never truly end in Westeros, and the Game of Thrones is played anew with each generation. But for now, the banners of House Stark and House Greyjoy had prevailed, binding lion's claws and iron chains and forging a new destiny, one that the realm would not soon forget. Robb Stark stood in the courtyard of Moat Cailin beneath a bruised sky of purples and blacks, lit only by pale moonlight. The banner of the direwolf flapped in a chill wind off the bogs. It felt good, after so many weeks in the south, to breathe northern air again, even if it was wet with swamp mist and carried the scent of rotting reeds. His army, battered by fierce battles yet victorious, had returned home at last. They filled the old fortress to the brim, crowding into its ancient halls, lighting fires and welcoming the comfort of stone walls that had once served as the sentinel between the north and the rest of the realm. He stood near a brazier, letting the heat soak into his hands, and tried to concentrate on the tasks that awaited him. After the fall of Casterly Rock, the negotiations with King's Landing, and Tywin Lannister's reluctant capitulation, Robb had little time to revel in triumph. The realm was not at peace, merely in a lull between storms. At times, his thoughts strayed to the moment he had stared Tywin Lannister in the eye in the Great Hall of the Rock, demanding his surrender. That memory still felt unreal. He knew how precarious the victory was. Lady Cailin approached across the muddy stones, her expression weary but touched by hope. She and Sansa had been nearly inseparable since Sansa's return. A reunion tinged with joy and sorrow, for Arya remained missing. Cailin had scoured every rumor on the road north, asked every traveler if they had seen a girl of Arya's description, but no one had offered conclusive answers. Now that they were here at Moat Cailin, she resumed those inquiries with a renewed desperation. But her love for Sansa was evident in every gesture. More than once, Robb had seen his mother touch her daughter's hair or hand, as though to reassure herself that Sansa was no dream. He turned when he heard Cailin's steps behind him. "Mother," he said softly. He glanced about to see if Sansa was with her, but she was not. Often, Sansa stayed inside, wanting to keep to quiet corners of the keep rather than subject herself to the stares of soldiers who had heard rumor after rumor of her captivity. Cailin moved closer to the brazier, warming her fingers. "You should rest," she said. "We've marched relentlessly. Your men need a chance to breathe." Robb allowed himself a weary chuckle. "I could say the same to you." She managed a small, tired smile. "Maybe we both could use the rest, but it must wait." The wind tugged at the loose strands of her auburn hair. "Ravens arrived this afternoon." He gave a brief nod. "Anything of importance?" "Some from the Riverlands. Word that Brynden holds Riverrun firmly, that the harvest is poor in some parts. We'll need to send seed or supplies if we want the Riverlands to recover quickly." Other messages came from King's Landing. "Cersei renews her demands about you, withdrawing the rest of the way and returning her father to his seat unconditionally." Robb clenched his jaw. The agreement was struck. Tywin was released when they gave us Sansa. He returns to Casterly Rock. That was the condition. What more could Cersei want? "She is concerned," Cailin said, "about the terms of the official treaty. The final documents are still being pored over by the Crown's lawyers and the small council. It seems they are trying to renege on the portion that recognizes the independence of the Iron Islands. They may yet accept the North's freedom, but they argue that the Iron Islands belong to the Iron Throne." Robb exhaled slowly, staring into the glow of the coals. 1,000 flickers of red danced in the metal basin. "Tywin must have whispered in her ear," he said. "He was forced to concede Balon's independence when we held Casterly Rock. Now that we've withdrawn, she might think to whittle away at that promise." His voice dropped in frustration. "But if we betray the Ironborn now, all we have won could be lost. Balon has proven his willingness to strike viciously. He could turn that fury upon the North in revenge." Cailin's eyes tightened. "So we must hold to that promise. The question is, will the Crown do the same? Or will this be the seed of a new conflict?" Robb rubbed the back of his neck, feeling the weight of his crown. An invisible burden, heavier than any metal band could ever be. "We will uphold our end," he said. "If the Iron Throne picks a fight with Balon, we won't be the ones to intervene on the Crown's behalf. Our only concern is making sure that the Ironborn don't raid our coasts or the Riverlands." His mother's lips formed a thin line. "We cannot trust Balon, but perhaps Theon can serve as a bridge between us. He did much to coordinate the alliance." Robb's expression darkened momentarily. "I've received no word from Theon since we parted in the Westerlands. Asha sent a single letter, a simple statement that Pike is theirs and they remain vigilant. Yet no word from Theon. I don't know if that's a good sign or a bad one." A sigh escaped him. "I still consider him a friend, even after everything. But I'm not so naive as to think the Ironborn see it that way." Cailin placed a hand on his arm. "He may be struggling to find his place. We must not assume betrayal yet." They stood in silence for a moment, hearing the faint clamor of men in the distance. Beyond Moat Cailin's walls, the swamps stretched in all directions, ghostly in the moon's reflection. This place had always been the gate to the north. Robb felt the tug of further responsibilities. Winterfell lay beyond, and beyond Winterfell, the uncertain rumblings of danger in the far north. Word of wildlings gathering under a new king beyond the wall had reached him in bits and pieces, but it seemed distant. Like so many troubles, it hovered at the edges of his concern, overshadowed by the war that had consumed them all. Yet the war itself was not truly over. The War of the Five Kings had begun with 5 claimants. Renly was dead, Stannis was hunkered down in Dragonstone, Joffrey clung to King's Landing, Balon now reigned as king of the Iron Islands, and Robb as king in the north. Even so, nobody spoke of peace in any permanent sense. Their uneasy ceasefires were pinned by necessity and worn alliances, not genuine reconciliation. The north was free, the Iron Islands were free, yet the crown still loomed over the rest of the realm, forging new deals with the Tyrells, mustering to face Stannis, and perhaps waiting for a day to challenge the new order in the north. Robb offered his mother his arm, and together they walked into the keep. Torchlight flickered on damp walls, revealing the old scars of siege and time. Men dozed in corners or sat polishing armor. Everywhere, the hush of tired breathing and weary vigilance pressed upon them. They came upon Sansa, seated on a wooden stool at the edge of a hearth. She was wrapped in a warm cloak, the edges embroidered with the direwolf. Her eyes, once bright with innocent dreams, looked older now. She was lost in thought, her fingers lightly curled around her wrists as if to calm trembling hands. "Sansa," Robb greeted, his voice gentle. She turned and attempted a smile. "Robb, mother." Cailin stepped forward and touched Sansa's cheek. "Are you well, my sweet girl? The wind is so cold tonight. Have you eaten?" Sansa nodded vaguely. "A little bread," she said. I was thinking about Arya. If we're home, then Arya should be here too. But she isn't." Robb crouched beside her, letting out a slow breath. "Arya's fate gnaws at me," he confessed. "We sent out word to all our bannermen in the Riverlands, to lords and sworn swords across the Trident. We'll do the same here in the north. If she's alive, we will find her. And I believe she is alive. Arya's a fighter. She always was." Sansa drew in a steadying breath. She tried to smile again, but tears glimmered in her eyes. "Thank you," she managed. Robb patted her hand. "In the meantime, we'll get you home. We'll get all of us home." For a moment, he thought of Winterfell as it had once been, warm hearths and laughter, the pup's tum. Ling about the yard, his father looking on with that quiet pride. That life felt like it belonged to another person entirely. Sansa bowed her head, exhaling softly. "I want to see the godswood again," she murmured. "I want to kneel by the heart tree and pray for Arya." Cailin brushed back a strand of Sansa's hair. "Then you shall," she promised, her voice gentle. Robb watched them both with a swirl of emotion in his chest. This war had cost them everything in some ways. Victories had come, yes, triumphs on the battlefield, and the forging of a brand new kingdom. But none of that could give them back the simplicity of their old lives. It was a bitter truth, one he was coming to accept. Being king in the north meant forging a new future, shaped by too many ghosts from the past. He stood. "We ride at first light," he told them both. "Let's be on our way to Winterfell before the weather worsens." Already the days grew shorter, the winds sharper. Although official word of winter had yet to be declared, everyone felt it skulking at the edges of the realm, eager to descend. If the old stories were true, the north would soon enough be blanketed in snow and ice. They parted with hushed farewells, and Robb returned to his men to ensure the next day's departure was well organized. The Great John was already deep in his ale, joking with some of the men. Roose Bolton lingered in a dark corner, polishing a small dagger with a rag. The pale eyes of the Lord of the Dreadfort flicked up at Robb when he passed. Bolton bowed his head slightly in deference, yet his face gave nothing away. Robb had never grown comfortable with Roose's quiet manner, but in truth, he was indispensable as a commander. Still, in the back of Robb's mind, a warning lingered. Be mindful of those who hide their thoughts behind a mask of civility. Early next morning, they broke camp. The columns of men, horses, and wagons formed, banners were furled or hung limp in the stagnant air, and they began the slow march northward. Once again, Moat Cailin stood behind them like a lonely sentinel as they passed beyond it. The wetlands gave way slowly to drier terrain, then forest roads lined by pine and looming oak. The travel was methodical, subdued. Gone was the urgent push of war campaigns. For all the men's scars, there was a sense of relief in heading home. Each night, they camped under thick boughs or near half-frozen streams. The crisp northern air filled their lungs. Robb felt some tension ease from his shoulders, though the burden of kingship remained. He rode at the head of the column on most days, gray wind loping alongside, scanning the shadows between the trees. Sansa and Catelyn traveled in a covered wagon for warmth, accompanied by a small retinue of guards. The Great John sometimes rode behind Robb, recounting tales from the war, how they'd nearly been overrun at the Battle of the Tumblestone, how the Ironborn had ravaged the Lannisters. Men who heard him cheered for the memory of those victories. On the 10th day out from Moat Cailin, a small group of riders met them on the road, bearing the banner of the Karstarks. Robb halted the column, urging his horse forward to greet them. He recognized Haryon Karstark in the lead, his father Rickard's eldest surviving son. "My lord," Haryon greeted, bowing in the saddle. "Or, rather, my king." He offered a strained smile. "You've returned at last. How fares your cause in the south?" Robb inclined his head in acknowledgement. The mention of Rickard Karstark stirred painful memories. Rickard had been executed by Robb's own hand in another life, in that dark canon of events that might have been, but not in this thread of possibility. Or perhaps Rickard was still alive in this telling. Let us keep the continuity of the prior narrative. In that earlier portion, we never heard of Karstark's betrayal or beheading, so perhaps the user wants to read a version in which Rickard's predicament might have changed. Let's continue carefully, weaving the story with possibility that Rickard might still be alive. He cleared his throat, setting aside that swirl of recollection. The war in the Westerlands is ended. Tywin has been forced to yield. We have independence now, Haryon. The North is free. A ripple of excitement passed through the Karstark riders. Haryon let out a breath. "That is welcome news indeed, your grace. My father awaits you in Winterfell." He had word from ravens, but nobody believed such a thorough victory could be won. "We are gladdened to see you safe. How do you find our land? The harvest was poor, but we're making do." "We'll see what can be done to help," Robb assured him. "Between the Riverlands and the north, we must brace for winter. Any chance to bolster our supplies is needed. Ride with us to Winterfell, Haryon. We have much to discuss." And so the Karstarks joined the traveling column. Haryon spoke quietly with Robb on the road, describing how the northern lords had struggled in the past year. Many had sent men south in Robb's name, leaving fewer hands for harvesting. Some fields were left half-reaped, and the early frosts had ruined some of the late crops. On top of that, wildling raiders had been sighted descending from the mountains near the Gift. Small hostilities, nothing on the scale of a true invasion, but enough to trouble the local folk. Robb listened carefully, each new worry layering onto his existing responsibilities. He had seized independence for the North, but now he had to secure it, to govern, to feed his people. And though the Lannisters might be wounded, King's Landing remained powerful, backed by the Tyrells, flush with the resources of the Fertile Reach. If the Crown decided to send an army north one day, or if it managed to rally the Vale's knights, or if any other complication arose, the North would stand on its own. That meant forging alliances, building strong walls, or at least ensuring that by the time the Crown attempted anything rash, the northern defenses would be unassailable. At the edge of the Wolfswood, the air grew colder, scented with pine and the faint musk of elk. The night they arrived at Winterfell, the moon was a thin crescent, and clouds scud past it like torn sails. The tall towers of the castle came into view, silhouettes in the silver gloom. A hush fell over the men. For many, it was the first time returning since they had marched away with Ned Stark's call to arms. Torches flickered along the gate, and a cheer rose from the walls as they recognized the royal party. The portcullis clanked open, welcoming them home. Robb felt a surge of emotion as he guided his horse through the gates. Winterfell. It smelled of memories. Wet stone, old iron, warm straw. At a glance, he could see the repairs. Broken sections of walls had been mended. The courtyard was cleared of rubble. Rickard Karstark stood with a handful of lords and stewards, waiting. Others emerged from the keep, among them Maester Luwin, whose face brightened at the sight of Robb and the others. A crowd of small folk pressed at the edges, trying to glimpse their young king. When Robb dismounted, Grey Wind padded in behind him, tail held high. Cailin followed, then Sansa. Their arrival was met with subdued reverence. Many had stories of the hardships they'd endured, and they hoped that the return of their king would bring stability. Rickard Karstark came forward, clasping Robb's arm with a soldier's grip. The man's beard was streaked with new gray, and lines of worry were etched into his face. "Your Grace," Rickard said, "my condolences for your father. I only wish he could have seen this day. The North free our rightful king home." Robb nodded, throat tight. "I share that wish." He glanced at the men around Rickard. Lords from lesser houses, sworn knights, all looking at him with expectation. "But let us remember him in how we rebuild. My father's dream was to protect the North. Now it is ours to uphold." With that, a ragged cheer went up. Men who had marched thousands of miles, and those who had remained, joined in relief. It wasn't the triumphant roar of a realm unscarred, but it held the promise of hope. Winterfell opened its doors, and Robb Stark went inside to his father's seat. A seat that was now his own. He only paused long enough to take in the great hall, the hearths lit with warm flames, the banners on the walls. He remembered the last time he had stood here before riding south, so full of uncertainty. After the formal greetings and a quick meal, Robb ascended to the solar. Cailin and Sansa, escorted by a retinue of guards, headed to their old chambers. Sansa's face had flickered with the beginnings of a genuine smile when she saw the tower she had once lived in. Even though the memories might be bittersweet, there was comfort in returning to something so familiar. Robb, however, found little rest. He convened his leading bannermen in a private council that same night. Rickard Karstark, Roose Bolton, Great John Umber, Galbart Glover, who had returned from the west, and others who had arrived in Winterfell since hearing of Robb's victory. They gathered in a chamber lit by thick beeswax candles. A map of the North unrolled on a heavy oak table. The men congratulated Robb, praising him for the cunning alliance with the Ironborn, the victories in the field, and the final blow against Tywin Lannister. Yet, as the celebratory words died, talk shifted to the present. Storm clouds gathered in their conversation. Reports came of livestock diseases in the neck, of bandits haunting the King's Road, of possible rebellions among certain mountain clans. One of Karstark's knights spoke up. "Your Grace, is it true that the crown challenges the Ironborn's independence? Could that mean war?" Roose Bolton's soft voice interjected. "War or no, the crown is not in a strong position to mount an invasion of the North right now. They remain at odds with Stannis. They must appease the Tyrells, and their coffers are diminished after funneling so much gold into the Lannister cause." He paused, steepling his fingers. "But in time they may rebuild. The young king on the Iron Throne is not known for wisdom, nor is his mother." The Great John snorted. "Let them come. We'll break their armies anew." Robb held up a hand. "We must be prepared, but I won't let the North bleed again without cause. For now, I'll fortify the Moat, the White Harbor, and key strongholds along the neck. We have some coin from Lannister ransoms and from the spoils of war, which we can invest in repairs and in strengthening garrisons. We must also ensure that we have enough food stored for the winter. Hungry men are angry men." Glover stepped forward, tapping a spot on the map near the rills. "The harvest was poor, but the fishing was good this autumn. We can salt or smoke the fish for the cold months. And the Crannogmen might be persuaded to share some of their caches if we offer them trade or protection from any who'd raid the neck." Harrion Karstark nodded. "Our storehouses in Carhold can spare some wheat and root vegetables, but not too much. We barely harvested enough." Robb listened closely to each suggestion, weighing them. The burden of kingship was new, but he had learned much on the battlefield, and in the negotiations that followed. "We have to unify our efforts," he said. "My father always believed that in the north we stand together or fall apart. We'll coordinate shipments of food among the lordships. Anyone found hoarding in times of scarcity will be penalized. We must keep our people fed and safe." The Great John leaned back, arms folded across his broad chest, his voice gruff. "And the Ironborn, your grace? Will they keep out of our hair now that they have their own kingdom? Or do we fear raids on Bear Island and the stony shore once the reavers grow hungry again?" Robb shifted in his seat. "We must be vigilant. Our treaty states that Balon Greyjoy will respect northern waters. For now, they have what they want in the Westerlands, and they seem to be entrenching there. Theon has not written, but I expect him to maintain our alliance. If the Ironborn break faith, we'll respond with force, and it'll be my priority to see that we're not caught unprepared." Roos's pale eyes flicked toward Robb, that unreadable expression he wore like a second skin. "And if the Crown persuades Balon to turn on us?" he asked softly. "The Crown is trying to deny Balon's independence. I doubt Balon would ever bend the knee to them," Robb answered. "They'd have to offer something truly immense to sway him. But it's a risk. Every angle of this realm is a risk right now." Silence settled for a moment, thick with the tension that lingered even in victory. Then Robb sighed and tapped the map. "We'll hold to our plan. Send word to White Harbor that they should expand their fleet if possible. War galleys, armed fishing vessels, anything. The Manderleys have always been able seafarers. It's time we had some naval presence of our own, in case we need to guard our shores from raiders, Ironborn or otherwise." The assembled lords murmured their assent. Robb could see the flicker of caution in their eyes, for building and maintaining a fleet was not the North's strength. Ships were expensive, and the North's forests and coasts were harsh, but necessity dictated new measures. Before the council ended, Roose Bolton inquired, "What of the Night's Watch? There have been rumors of trouble beyond the wall. Wildlings massing under a king beyond the wall, and stranger tales." Robb paused. The memory of old stories made the back of his neck prickle. His father had taught them the tales, White Walkers, the Long Night, folklore old and half-forgotten. Yet the dire reports from beyond the wall, about the dead rising or monstrous shapes in the snow, troubled him in ways he couldn't quite name. But so far, that news felt distant. He cleared his throat. "We'll send what provisions we can spare to Castle Black, as is tradition. Let them focus on their duties. If Mance Rayder truly has a horde, then the Watch will need every bit of help we can offer. But I can't spare men to march north. Not now. We must rebuild first." Roose inclined his head. "Wise, your grace." With that, they dispersed. Robb lingered in the council room, running his fingertips over the lines of the map where the wall was drawn in ink. The land north of it was a vast blank, only scattered markings for mountains and haunted forests. Once that had felt like another world. Now, with winter approaching and the threat of an unsettled realm, every corner of the map felt closer than it had before. He let out a breath and finally retired. He walked the long corridors of Winterfell, passing by old tapestries, flickering torches, and the occasional guard who saluted him. When he stepped into his childhood room, now refitted with more ornate furnishings in deference to his station, he felt an odd pang. So much had happened since he'd last slept here. The bed was the same, but he was not. The shadows seemed deeper, the corners quieter. Gray wind pressed his muzzle against Robb's hand, as if sensing his unease. Robb scratched behind the direwolf's ears and sighed. "We're home," he murmured. "But it's not the same home we left." He undressed, washing quickly with tepid water in a basin. The chill in the air sank into his bones. Climbing into bed, he tried to close his eyes, but sleep came only after fitful tossing. His dreams haunted by images of the Red Keep, of Tywin's green-eyed glare, of black sails bearing krakens, and of a lost sister wandering unfamiliar roads. Winterfell awoke the next morning with purpose. Ravens flapped from the rookery, bearing messages to every corner of the north, from the last hearth to Deepwood Moat, from White Harbor to the Dreadfort. Scribes jotted down new trade arrangements, the beginnings of a wide-scale plan to distribute resources. The castle smith worked tirelessly, forging nails, replacement arms, iron fittings for harnesses. Servants scurried about, preparing for the possibility of a long, hard winter. Sansa stood at a window in her old tower, gazing out at the snow flurries drifting in the courtyard. She wore a heavy cloak of gray wool. Her reflection in the glass reminded her of how changed she was. She had left Winterfell a girl, believing in songs of knights and queens. She returned older in spirit, her illusions peeled away by captivity and the cruelty of King's Landing. Yet, she also felt a quiet strength inside herself, a core she had discovered in her darkest hours. She turned at a knock on the door. To her mild surprise, it was Rickon, though so much older than the last time she had seen him. He was not quite a child anymore, but not a man either. A lanky boy of about 9, with long brown hair and bright gray eyes that flashed with pent-up energy. Shaggy Dog, his black direwolf, peered in from behind him, tongue lolling. "Sansa," Rickon said, bounding into the room. "They told me you were here." He rushed to hug her waist. She wrapped her arms around him, marveling at how tall he'd gotten. "Rickon," she murmured, "you've grown so much." She ruffled his hair, noticing how he squirmed with pride. "Where's Bran?" she asked gently, realizing she hadn't seen him yet. She'd heard that Bran had survived the fall from the tower but had lost the use of his legs. The last time she'd truly talked with him was so long ago. Rickon's face fell a little. "Bran's in his chambers with Hodder. He doesn't come out much. But maybe now that you're here." Sansa nodded, heart aching. "I'll go to him soon. I've missed you both terribly." She paused. "And I missed Father." Her throat closed momentarily, grief heavy on her heart. Rickon nodded solemnly, and for a moment, they shared the silent sorrow of Ned Stark's death. She crouched down, though she remained a bit taller than him, so she could look in his eyes. "We'll be together now. We'll take care of each other, all of us." Rickon's lip trembled, but he nodded fiercely. "I'm old enough to fight if they come," he declared. "You know, when the snows melt. And I'll keep Shaggy Dog with me." Sansa squeezed his hand. "I hope we won't need more fighting. But if it comes, you'll do your part, I know." She couldn't help smiling at his earnestness. She remembered her own illusions about knighthood and chivalry, how naive she had been. Rickon still had a child's raw bravery, untempered by the horrors of real war. Perhaps it was a gift that he still possessed some innocence. After he left, bounding down the stairs with Shaggy Dog at his heels, Sansa gazed again at the courtyard. The wind whistled. She closed her eyes and sent a silent prayer to the old gods, asking them to protect her family and guide them in these uncertain times. Perhaps tonight she would visit the godswood, kneel by the heart tree, and beg for Arya's safety, wherever she might be. Elsewhere in the castle, Robb moved among the ramparts with the Great John, discussing fortifications. Guards saluted as he passed, calling, "Your Grace," in respectful tones. He peered over the outer walls, scanning the landscape. The snows were light now, but soon the drifts might rise above a man's knee. With a thoughtful expression, he noted places where the walls would need buttressing, where fresh mortar might keep out the worst of the ice. Great John teased that soon they'd all be stuck inside, howling at each other like caged wolves. Robb only half smiled. During midday, he received a summons from Maester Luwin. In the Solar, the old maester was seated by a table scattered with scrolls, each bearing different seals from lords scattered across Westeros. He rose at Robb's entrance, bowing slightly. "Your Grace," Luwin greeted. "I hope your rest was good, though I suspect you have little time for it." His tone carried the warmth of an old family advisor, unafraid to speak gently. Robb took a seat, gesturing for Luwin to remain seated. "Spare me the formalities, Maester. What news do we have?" Luwin adjusted his chain. "A raven arrived from the Dreadfort. Lord Bolton left with you, of course, but his castellans have reported raiders near the Skagos coast. Likely men from beyond the wall or other renegades. Additionally, word from White Harbor suggests that Lord Wyman Manderley is amenable to your request for an expanded fleet, though it will take time and a substantial investment of coin. Robb folded his arms. We'll have to see what we can spare. Tell Lord Manderley we'll send him gold from the Lannister ransoms, and we'll pay the shipwrights promptly. The faster they can build or refit vessels, the better. Luwin nodded, making a note on a scrap of parchment. Also, 2 ravens from King's Landing. One official, bearing the seal of the crown, Queen Regent Cersei, I presume. Another from the hand of the king, Lord Tyrion Lannister. Robb's eyebrows rose. Tyrion? He repeated. He could not claim he knew Tyrion well, but he recalled hearing that the imp had become hand of the king after Tywin's capture. The man was said to be cunning, though overshadowed by his father in Lannister circles. He drummed his fingers on the table. What does he say? Luwin carefully selected a scroll with a red wax seal featuring a golden lion. He's written in a surprisingly candid tone, Your Grace. He acknowledges that the crown has little choice but to recognize the North's independence, yet he entreats you not to side with Balon Greyjoy if the Iron Islands clash with the crown. He offers talk of open trade between the North and the Crownlands, plus a possible arrangement for the exchange of certain goods, grain from the Reach, finished textiles from the Crownlands in return for pelts, wood, and metals from the North. Robb frowned thoughtfully. So Tyrion is proposing that I remain neutral if the crown decides to move against Balon. No doubt he wants to isolate the Ironborn. He probably hopes we'd even blockade them from the land side if conflict arises. That would break their power. Yes, that is the thrust of his letter, Luwin said. He frames it as a purely defensive arrangement, beneficial to both. And to be frank, the letter from the Queen Regent is less cordial. She again disputes the Iron Islands' independence. She demands that you rescind your alliance with Balon or risk trade sanctions. She also hints, rather unsubtle, that the crown might move to retake the North if you do not cooperate. Robb's jaw clenched. She can threaten all she likes, but she's in no position to launch an invasion now. Still, we can't dismiss the possibility that once they reassemble their strength, they'll test our defenses. As for Tyrion's letter, it's more cunning. He's offering us something tempting. Safe, sanctioned trade with the southern realms. That's valuable, especially if we face a hard winter. Maester Luwin gave a small nod. We live in uncertain times, Your Grace. The North must look to its people's well-being. Robb studied the worn tabletop, traces of old ink stains marking the grain. Send Tyrion a polite reply, he said at last. Indicate that we remain open to trade, but will not commit to any aggression against Balon Greyjoy so long as the Ironborn keep their agreements with us. We fought side by side. I'm not about to break faith without cause. Emphasize that if the crown truly wants peace, it should respect the independence of the Iron Islands, too, or come to some negotiated arrangement that Balon will accept. Luwin dipped his quill in ink. As you say, Your Grace, and the Queen Regent's letter. Thank her for her concern, Robb said dryly. Reiterate that we hold to the treaty agreed upon when she returned my sister, and that we expect the crown to do the same. Keep it brief. I see no need to waste words on her threats. Very well, Luwin said, a ghost of a smile on his lips. I shall write accordingly. Robb stood, clasping the old man's shoulder gently. Thank you, Maester. Your counsel is invaluable. As he turned to go, Luwin cleared his throat. Your Grace, there is something else, more personal. A raven from Tarth. Robb paused, eyebrows arched. From Brienne? No, Your Grace, though it pertains to her. It's from her father, Lord Selwyn Tarth. He inquires about Brienne's whereabouts. She's rumored to be in the Riverlands, but he has not heard from her in months. Robb recalled the towering Lady Knight who had served Lady Cailin for a time. He remembered Brienne of Tarth's fierce dedication to Cailin, her prowess in arms, how she had lost King Renly before pledging to avenge him. Since then, the chaos of war had scattered many. I know little of her current path, he admitted. She was in the Riverlands, last I heard, searching for... Well, she might have been hunting some 'cause related to the war. My mother would know more, perhaps. Luwin nodded, adding it to a mental list. I'll ask Lady Cailin. Lord Selwyn's letter is polite but concerned. In these times, a father's worry is understandable. With that, Robb departed. He found the day had grown dim, the gray light seeping through Winterfell's windows. Men passed him in the corridors, nodding respectfully. Servants scurried carrying baskets of supplies, fresh linens for the returning lords. The hum of renewed life in the castle was tangible. He made his way to Bran's chambers, uncertain of what greeting awaited him. Outside the door stood Hodder, the gentle giant in rough-spun clothes, fiddling with his hands. "Hodder," the man said shyly, giving Robb a bob of his head. Robb smiled. "Hello, Hodder. May I see my brother?" "Hodder," he repeated, stepping aside. Inside, a fire crackled in the hearth, and candles lit the corners of the room. Bran sat in a wooden chair near a window, his legs wrapped in blankets. He was taller than Robb remembered, though still slight of build. The lines of his face held a dreamlike quality, as though he existed partly in another world. Summer, his direwolf, lay curled near the hearth, golden eyes half-lidded. When Bran looked up, his eyes lit with cautious hope. "Robb," he said softly, setting aside a small carved figure he'd been shaping from wood. Robb crossed the room in a few steps, kneeling beside Bran's chair to embrace him. He realized how long it had been since he'd seen his brother's face, and how little time they'd truly spent together before the chaos of the war. "Bran, I've missed you," he said, his voice rough with emotion. Bran returned the embrace awkwardly. "I'm glad you're back. Is it true what they say, that you beat the Lannisters and they made you king in the north?" Robb swallowed. "Yes," he said. "We forced Tywin Lannister to surrender in his own seat. The north is free now." He tried to keep pride out of his voice, mindful of Bran's quiet acceptance of these momentous changes. Bran nodded thoughtfully. "Father would be proud." His gaze drifted to the fire. "But you're our king," he said, sounding both impressed and faintly troubled. "Does that mean you'll stay here? Or will you have to ride off to wars again?" Robb brushed a hand across Bran's hair. "I want to stay," he said gently. "Winterfell is our seat, but I must ensure the safety of the north. There may be times I have to leave." He hesitated. "What of you, Bran? How do you fare?" Bran shrugged a shoulder, looking down at his wrapped legs. "I can't feel them anymore," he said, though Robb knew that well. "But sometimes when I sleep, I dream of walking, of running through the trees with summer at my side. And other dreams, too," he added, a distant expression crossing his features. "Wolves, ravens, the heart tree. I don't understand them all." Robb nodded, remembering how Maester Luwin had always spoken of such dreams as just that, dreams. Yet part of Robb suspected there might be more to it, especially given the old tales of skin changers and greenseers. But those were matters beyond his immediate reckoning. "If they bring you any comfort, I'm glad for it," he told Bran softly. "If they trouble you, speak to me or Mother." Bran's lips curved in a small smile. "I will." Summer raised his head, ears flicking, and Robb ruffled the direwolf's fur in greeting. The wolf licked Robb's hand, and Robb chuckled. In that moment, a wave of nostalgia hit him, memories of the day they found the direwolf pups, fresh fallen snow and wide-eyed wonder. Their father's voice echoed in his mind. They were meant to have them. That day seemed 1,000 lifetimes ago. "Hodder?" came the gentle giant's voice from the corridor. "I should go," Robb said, standing. He squeezed Bran's shoulder once more. "But I'll be here for some time yet. I'll try to visit you every day." He paused, meeting Bran's gaze. "If there's anything you need, anything at all, you come to me. We're family." Bran nodded, and a flicker of warmth touched his eyes. "Thank you, Robb." Outside, Robb lingered for a moment, leaning against the cold stone of the corridor wall. What sort of future did the North hold for Bran, for Rickon, for Sansa? He clenched his fists. He had to believe the wars would subside long enough for them to have a semblance of peace. Yet, in the back of his mind, he heard distant howls, winds from the far north, carrying rumors of a winter that might change everything. News came days later that Balon Greyjoy had dispatched longships to reinforce the coasts he still held near Lannisport. Although the crown had tried to form a new royal fleet to oust the Ironborn, Tyrion's letter had spoken truly. The crown was not yet strong enough for such a large-scale confrontation, especially with Stannis lurking at Dragonstone. Meanwhile, the Tyrells had pushed for peace, not wanting the shipping lanes from Highgarden to be threatened by Ironborn raids. It seemed that, for the moment, Balon remained unchallenged in the western seas. From Pike itself, nothing arrived except a few short missives referencing trade in salted fish and local iron. Theon's signature was nowhere to be found. Robb wondered if Theon was drifting away from the memory of their friendship, losing himself in the old ways of the Ironborn. Perhaps Theon believed he had done his duty by forging the alliance that shattered the Lannisters' naval power. Now, with independence won for the Iron Islands, maybe he felt there was nothing left to hold him to the north. A pang of regret mixed with gratitude in Robb's chest. Theon had delivered them the advantage that shaped the war, but at what cost to his own identity? The quiet of Winterfell's routine soon wore on Robb's nerves. Though he cherished seeing his family, every day brought new duties, new problems, and an endless stream of petty disputes among lords, stewards, and small folk. He found himself in the Great Hall, presiding over quarrels about grazing rights, boundary lines, or missing livestock. It was worlds away from the drama of battle, yet in its own way it was more taxing. A king must be just, he reminded himself, and fair. His father had always listened intently to even the smallest complaint, fulfilling his duty as Warden of the North. At the same time, Cailin was urging him to consider an official crowning ceremony, a formal recognition of his kingship in front of all northern lords, so that none could dispute his claim. Technically, the men had already hailed him as king in the north when he first rebelled against the Iron Throne, but that had been in the field, carried out in the heat of outrage at Ned's death. Now, with his victory and the North's independence, a formal coronation would solidify his rule. At first, Robb resisted, thinking it a vanity. But as he considered the political ramifications, he came to see it as wise. The lords needed a symbol of unity, a moment to swear renewed vows of loyalty before the Heart Tree, to remind everyone that the North stood as one. He consented, and so the castle bustled with preparations. Messages flew out to every northern holdfast, inviting them to attend a great feast and coronation at Winterfell. Over the next few weeks, as winter's grip tightened, the lords began to arrive. Some came accompanied by large retinues, braving the snowy roads. The courtyards and halls grew crowded. The Karstarks arrived in force, Lord Rickard at their head. The Glovers came from Deepwood Moat, the Mormonts from Bear Island, and lords from the White Knife. The Umbers, led by the Great John, naturally made a boisterous entrance, swilling ale and roaring about old battles. Roose Bolton, quiet as ever, brought a tidy company of men in subdued livery. Even the Manderleys dispatched an emissary from White Harbor, Ser Wylis Manderley, as Lord Wyman was too large and infirm to travel easily. Sansa took on some of the duties of a hostess, welcoming the ladies of the North with polite courtesy, though she was still shaken by her experiences in King's Landing. Lady Catelyn managed most of the details, ensuring that the feast was worthy of a royal gathering. Winterfell's kitchens worked around the clock, roasting boar, baking pies, and preparing the salted fish that was a northern staple. Mead, ale, and spiced wine were laid in ample supply to warm chilled bones. The day of the ceremony dawned gray and cold, but the flurries were mild, and the yard was cleared of deep snow. A dais was set before the weirwood in the Godswood, the Heart Tree's face gazing solemnly at the gathering. Robb stood in new furs, carefully groomed, though his hair retained the disheveled look of a man more accustomed to campaign tents than courts. Gray Wind prowled at a respectful distance, uncertain of the crowd. One by one, the northern lords assembled, forming a half-circle around the Heart Tree. Their cloaks draped heavily, footprints crunching in the frost. The Godswood glowed with an otherworldly silence, broken only by the wind sighing through bare branches. Robb's heart pounded. He felt the weight of eyes upon him. All these men had followed him to war or supported him from afar. He had led them to independence. Now he had to lead them into whatever future awaited. Cailin stepped forward with Maester Luwin at her side, a simple circlet of bronze in her hands, an ancient piece rumored to have once graced the brow of a king in the North centuries past. The blacksmiths had refitted it to a modest style. No rubies or emeralds glittered on it, though a single polished weirwood gem was set at the front, carved in the shape of a direwolf's head. It was a crown of the old ways, austere and powerful in its simplicity. Robb felt the hush grow deeper. He looked up at the heart tree, at the red sap tears that lined its pale trunk. He remembered prayers from his childhood, reciting them beside his father. Closing his eyes, he took a breath and murmured his vow. I swear to be a just king for the North, to protect these lands and her people. I swear by the old gods, in the sight of this heart tree, that I will keep faith and protect the North as my father taught me. Then he knelt and Cailin, tears glistening in her eyes, placed the crown upon his head. She kissed his brow softly. Rise, Robb Stark, king in the North. As he stood, the lords raised a cheer that echoed through the godswood, sending crows fluttering from the branches. The king in the North, they roared. Great John Umber's voice boomed louder than any. Rickard Karstark echoed it with fervor. Roose Bolton dipped his head in tacit acknowledgement. The Manderly emissary shouted praises, and other northern lords bellowed in unison. The air thrummed with the raw force of their loyalty. Robb looked around at these men, these allies, these sometimes rivals. They were his now, his to shepherd, his to guard, and his to unite. The shining moment of triumph coursed through him, yet he felt the pressing knowledge of what came next. A crown was not the end of a journey. It was merely another beginning. After the ceremony, they feasted in the great hall. Long tables groaned under the weight of roasts, pies, and pitchers of ale. Mead warmed throats, and conversation flowed with an excitement not seen since before the war. Musicians played northern ballads, and the fire crackled in the massive hearth, driving out the chill. Sansa sat near Robb, though she rarely spoke. Still, her presence was a comfort. Cailin circulated among the lords, accepting congratulations. The Great John led raucous toasts in Robb's honor. Lords declared that the North would remain unconquered forever. They drank to the memory of Ned Stark, to the health of all the Starks, and to the absent Arya. Robb drank sparingly, not wanting to dull his senses, but the crowd insisted he partake in at least a few hearty gulps. A sense of camaraderie bound them, as if the entire North was collectively sighing in relief at having endured the war. Yet, in the corner of his eye, Robb spotted Roose Bolton, who ate quietly and partook of no toasts. Even as the hall erupted in celebration, Roose remained a figure of calm, methodical presence. When Robb caught his eye, Bolton offered the barest of nods. Eventually, the feast wound down, men stumbling off to find beds, or to continue drinking in smaller gatherings. Robb excused himself, leaving Great John to regale the hall with further war stories. He made his way onto the battlements, seeking a breath of fresh, cool air. The snow had started again, dusting the towers and courtyards in a fine, pale veil. He leaned on the parapet, gazing over Winterfell's walls. Flickers of torchlight illuminated small knots of men still awake. The sky was a swirling patch of gray and black, the moon hidden. Gray wind padded up beside him, pressing close for warmth. Robb stroked the direwolf's neck, thinking of all that lay ahead. Now that he was crowned, in truth, the realm and indeed the world would take note. He thought of the crown in King's Landing, how they might bristle at the formal crowning. How might Cersei or Tyrion respond? Perhaps it would matter little, so long as the North remained too formidable to assault. And what of Balon Greyjoy, now crowned king of the Iron Islands in his own right? The man had no reason to betray Robb yet, but the Ironborn mind was fickle, driven by plunder and pride. If they found themselves bored or hungry for new spoils, might they turn on the North? Soft footsteps approached on the rampart. He turned to see Cailin, wrapped in a heavy cloak. She drew it close as she joined him, gazing out across the courtyard. "It was a good ceremony," she said quietly, though a hint of sadness lurked in her tone. "I only wish your father could have seen you with his own eyes." Robb nodded, feeling a hollow ache in his chest. "Sometimes I feel him watching," he confessed, "in the Godswood or in the Great Hall. His memory lingers in every stone." Cailin smiled thinly. "He does. Ned was always so proud of you, Robb, and so would he be now." She looked at him more directly. "You realize your responsibilities now are greater than ever? Our people will look to you for everything. Protection, sustenance, leadership." "I do," Robb said, "and I'll do my best. The war taught me that battles aren't just fought with swords. They're fought with gold, with alliances, with farmland and trade. This peace we've carved out, it might be as fragile as glass." She reached for his hand. "You have me, and all of us, to help you shoulder that burden. You needn't bear it alone." He squeezed her hand gently. "Thank you, Mother. But there's something else. Something we haven't spoken of much since we returned. Cattle." Wyann's brow furrowed. "Arya," she said softly. Robb nodded, throat tight. "We mustn't give up on finding her. If she's out there." "She is," Cailin said with fierce certainty, though tears sparked in her eyes. "I'll send more men south. There are still loyal contacts in the Riverlands who might have heard rumors. Perhaps Brynden can help coordinate a search." "That's what I hoped you'd say," Robb replied, relief and sorrow mingling in his tone. "If I can spare a few dozen riders to comb the roads, discreetly ask questions, maybe we'll find a lead." Cailin tilted her head, her features cast in the flickering torchlight. "We'll try, Robb. Promise. But in these times, so many are displaced, so much chaos. She could be anywhere." Robb squeezed her hand again, then released it to brace against the cold stone. For a while, they simply stood side by side, the only sound the soft scuff of snow and the distant drunken laughter from below. The north was free, and they were together, yet ghosts haunted them at every turn. "Ned, Arya, the future itself." Then footsteps sounded again. Rickard Karstark emerged from the stairs, his breath steaming in the air. He bowed. "Your Grace, my lady," he greeted. "I hope I'm not interrupting." Robb turned, adjusting the cloak around his shoulders. "Not at all. What is it?" Karstark cleared his throat. "We have a letter from the Wall. A ranger of the Night's Watch delivered it earlier, though I only just saw it. It's troubling." Robb's stomach tightened. "Tell me." Karstark handed over a rolled parchment. Robb glanced at Cailin, who looked equally uneasy. He unrolled the parchment, squinting in the torchlight to read the scrawled words. They were penned by the Lord Commander of the Night's Watch, Jeor Mormont. Robb murmured the contents aloud. "To His Grace Robb Stark, King in the North, we have encountered many wildlings in the haunted forest and reports of a large host moving south, led by Mance Rayder, styling himself King Beyond the Wall. More disturbingly, our rangers speak of unnatural occurrences. Dead men walking, others sighted with blue eyes. The Watch is ill-equipped to face them if they come in large numbers. Winter is near, and we beg the realms of men for aid." He trailed off, feeling a chill unrelated to the winter air. Cailin drew closer, peering at the letter. Rickard Karstark's expression was grave. "The Watch begs for reinforcements and supplies," the older man said quietly. "They claim the threat is real, though it sounds like a child's nightmare." Robb recalled old stories. White Walkers, others the Long Night. He knew the Night's Watch rarely sent such desperate pleas without cause. If Lord Commander Mormont spoke of it so plainly, it could not be dismissed as mere rumor. "We have so many demands on our resources," he muttered, mind racing. "But if there's any truth to this..." Caitlin's face was pale. "Robb, we must at least listen. Your father always said to take the Watch's warnings seriously. They guard the realm. That includes us." Robb nodded, rolling the parchment. "Tell me, Lord Karstark, Do we have any men we could spare? Even a small force might help fortify the wall until we know more. Karstark hesitated. I can contribute some men, but we must feed them, arm them, clothe them. And that's not to mention the risk if the crown decides to test our borders in the south. A headache pulsed behind Robb's temples. He realized that the north might face a threat far worse than another southern war if the stories were true. Yet, ignoring the warning could be catastrophic. We'll have to muster volunteers, Robb said at last. I can't strip the north of too many defenders, but a small contingent to Castle Black might be feasible. With them, we'll send supplies, grain, furs, dragonglass if we have it. Karstark blinked. Dragonglass. Robb forced a faint smile. Old tales speak of it as a weapon against the others. In any case, obsidian is rumored to be effective if the tales are true. It's precious rare here in the north, but we might have some. The Watch can test it. Cailin exhaled slowly. We must pray these tales are exaggerated, but better to be safe. She placed a hand on Robb's arm. This is the duty of a king, my son. Protect your people from all threats. Robb tucked the letter away. I'll convene the lords after the coronation celebrations subside. We'll arrange a relief force for Castle Black. I only hope we're not too late. With that grim pronouncement, the night's revelry faded from Robb's mind, replaced by the somber reminder that victory over the Lannisters was only one chapter in a longer, darker saga. The War of the Five Kings had consumed them, but beyond the wall, an older war might be stirring. A war of ice and death, of ancient powers unbound by mortal crowns. Robb felt the cold wind cut through him as if it carried the voices of the ages, whispering of winter's vengeance and the need for unity among the living. A week passed, and with it came further tidings from the south. Letters from Brynden Tully at Riverrun confirmed that the Riverlands still bore scars from the fighting, but the main hostilities had ceased. Tywin Lannister had returned to the Westerlands, publicly furious and humiliated, but apparently more concerned with rebuilding his power base than launching a new assault. King's Landing remained in relative stability, with Tyrion Lannister as hand, the Tyrell alliance shoring up Joffrey's rule, and Stannis still a shadowy threat. Meanwhile, in the west, the Ironborn had not withdrawn from the coastal strongholds they seized, ignoring the crown's impotent demands that they relinquish them. The realm seemed to be settling into a tense, wary stalemate, everyone too drained by war to initiate another. In Winterfell, Robb prepared to dispatch a small force northward. The volunteers would be led by Galbart Glover, a reliable man known for caution and bravery alike. They would carry wagons of supplies for Castle Black. If the Watch's warnings were false or exaggerated, so be it, but if they were not, the North would not be caught unawares. Bran watched their preparations with wide eyes, listening to Robb explain quietly that these men were going to help the Night's Watch. In a private moment, Robb took Galbart aside. In truth, I wish I could spare more, Robb said, glancing at the lines of soldiers gathering in the courtyard. No more than 100 plus support staff, but every man is needed to keep order across the rest of the North, especially with winter coming. Do your best at the wall and send word if you need more. Glover nodded, his face set in grim determination. We'll do our duty. If what Lord Commander Mormont says is true, the realm faces something more dangerous than any southern king. Robb squeezed the man's shoulder. The old gods watch over you. They parted, and Robb stood on the steps of the great keep, watching the column of men, horses, and wagons pass through Winterfell's gates. The sound of hooves and cart wheels crunching over the packed snow seemed eerily loud in the hush of the morning. Their breath misted in the cold air, fusing with the slow-falling snow. Some small folk looked on with guarded curiosity, perhaps wondering why their king cared so much for the Night's Watch. When the last of them disappeared into the swirling white, Robb turned inside, gray wind padding after him. He brushed fresh snow off his cloak and made his way toward the hall where the day's tasks awaited. More petitions from minor lords, updates on the fleet at White Harbor, the endless complexities of rulership. Yet, even as he tried to focus on the mundane, he couldn't shake the sense of a gathering storm on the horizon. Letters arrived from beyond the north, rumor and speculation swirling about Daenerys Targaryen in the east. Whispers of dragons reborn, though many discounted it as nonsense. Stories said she had 3 dragons, but no one in Westeros had laid eyes on them. If it were true, it might one day change the balance of power. For now, it felt distant, overshadowed by the more immediate threat in the far north. One late afternoon, while Robb reviewed grain counts with some stewards, a servant rushed in, eyes wide. "Your Grace," he gasped, breathless. Riders approach from the neck, banners with a red sun pierced by a spear. "The Martells of Dorne." Robb's head snapped up. "Dorne?" He exchanged a glance with Cailin, who was helping him read the accounts. They both knew Dorne had mostly sat out the War of the Five Kings, nursing old grudges against the Lannisters but not openly supporting any other claim. Now a party from Dorne was riding into Winterfell? He closed the ledger, rising from his seat. "Show them every courtesy," he said. "Find them rooms, warm them with mulled wine. I'll receive them in the Great Hall." He glanced at Cailin. Could this be about a new alliance? Dorne has never been close with the crown, especially after what happened to Elia Martell. Cailin stood, smoothing her skirts. "We'll soon see." They hurried to prepare. By the time the party was ushered in, the servants had cleared the hall of the day's business, building up the fires. Robb sat on the ancient wooden seat of the Kings of Winter, Cailin by his side, and Grey Wind at his feet. A small escort of northern lords flanked him, curious about these southern visitors. The Dornish riders entered in a swirl of vibrant clothing and desert flair. Scarlet and orange silks, shining helms, their cloaks dusted with snow that clearly unsettled them. At their head walked Prince Oberyn Martell, known across the realm as the Red Viper. He was a lithe man with dark, intense eyes, wearing fine leather and silks embroidered with gold thread. A spear strapped to his back bore the Martell sun and spear crest. Behind him trailed a few Dornish knights, along with Ilaria Sand, a woman with a knowing smile and warm eyes. Oberyn stepped forward, regarding Robb with a curious tilt of the head. "King in the north," he said, letting the words roll off his tongue. "I am Oberyn Nymeros Martell, Prince of Dorne. I thank you for receiving us." Robb inclined his head. "Prince Oberyn, your presence is unexpected, but I welcome you to Winterfell. You've come a long way from Sunspear." Oberyn's lips curved into a slight smile. "We Dornish are no strangers to travel, though your northern snows are less friendly than our deserts." He took in the hall with a quick, discerning gaze. "You've had quite a year, King Robb. A rebellion against the Iron Throne, an alliance with the Ironborn, and now an independent North. We Martells know something of independence. I have come to see whether we might have common cause." Robb arched an eyebrow. He remembered how, historically, Dorne had joined the Seven Kingdoms last of all, through marriage rather than conquest. They still retained distinct laws and a fierce pride in their autonomy. "Dorne sat out the fighting for the most part," Robb said carefully. "Yet you have grievances with the Lannisters. I recall hearing of your sister's fate during the sack of King's Landing." Oberyn's eyes flashed with anger. "Yes, Elia Martell and her children were murdered by Lannister dogs. My family has not forgotten." He paused, glancing meaningfully at Robb. "Now that Tywin Lannister has been humbled, we wonder if the time is ripe to settle old scores. Perhaps we can help each other." A hush fell across the hall. Cailin studied Oberyn with caution. The northern lords looked intrigued but wary of a southern alliance. Robb laced his fingers together, resting them on his knee. "You speak frankly. I appreciate that," he said. "But Tywin Lannister is not my prisoner anymore. He was forced to yield, but we released him. My war with him was to secure the North's independence, not to further any personal vendetta, though I can't say we lacked for reasons to hate him." Oberyn nodded. "I am aware, but I still see an opportunity. House Martell has no love for the Iron Throne under Lannister sway. The Lannisters are allied with the Tyrells, and that alliance is what keeps King Joffrey on his throne. But if the North and Dorne were to stand in solidarity, if we applied pressure from two distant ends of the realm, the crown might find itself short of breath. Robb's eyes narrowed slightly. You propose war? Another war, after we've barely ended the last. Oberyn's lips parted in a smile that did not reach his eyes. Only if necessary. But consider, the crown may try to subjugate the north in time. And we Martells have never knelt easily. We resisted Aegon the Conqueror longer than any. We have old pacts with the Targaryens. Should a Targaryen return, we might remember that. But that is for the future. Right now, I believe we share a common desire to see the Lannisters' power broken for good. Especially Tywin's. A hush filled the chamber. Robb felt an echo of anger at Tywin, recalling how the man had orchestrated Ned's fall. But he also felt the fresh weight of his own responsibilities. Would an alliance with Dorne serve the North? Or would it drag them into more bloodshed? He had just begun to rebuild. But Oberyn's logic was tempting. If the crown did try to retake the North, an alliance with Dorne might deter them. The Martells were formidable, especially if they decided to coordinate with any who opposed the Lannisters. Cailin spoke softly at his side. We would need assurances, Prince Oberyn. The North has bled enough. We do not seek to bleed again unless forced. Oberyn bowed his head in acknowledgement. I understand, my lady. I only propose that we formalize friendly relations, at the very least trade, mutual defense pacts, the sharing of intelligence. As for Tywin, we Martells shall address our personal vendetta in due time. But if you or your advisors wish to discuss terms for a broader alliance, we are open to that. Robb studied the Dornish prince. The man was rumored to be deadly with a spear, cunning in his negotiations, and passionate in every pursuit. He was no fool either. Then let us discuss it, Robb said. We can meet in private with a small circle of advisors. I am not prepared to commit to any renewed hostilities, but I'm willing to hear how such an alliance might benefit the North. In turn, I'll see how we can ensure Dorne's trade and security. We stand in a new era, one that might be shaped by old grudges or by fresh alliances. Oberyn's grin sharpened. Excellent. I look forward to the conversation. With that, the formalities ended. Robb had the Dornish envoys led to warm rooms, where they could rest from their journey. He dismissed most of the northern lords, who grumbled about mixing with hot-blooded Dornish. Bolton slipped away without comment, which Robb found typical. The man rarely showed his hand until absolutely necessary. As night fell, Robb paced in the great keep, gray wind ghosting at his heels. Another alliance, more diplomatic entanglements. He was king in the north, but half his time was spent juggling politics. He thought of how Theon had championed an Ironborn alliance. Without that alliance, they might never have beaten the Lannisters. Perhaps forging ties with Dorne could be similarly vital. Yet part of him longed for a simpler life, a life where he was just a son of Winterfell, learning from his father, teasing his siblings, running with the direwolves. He paused at a high window, looking out at the bleak northern sky. Snow drifted lazily across the battlements. He drew in a cold breath and whispered to himself, "Winter is coming, in more ways than one." A few days later, he sat with Oberyn in a small solar, where a brazier crackled. Cailin was present, along with Roose Bolton, Rickard Karstark, and Maester Luwin. On the Dornish side stood Oberyn, Illyria Sand, and two of his knights. They spoke over mulled wine. Oberyn laid out his vision. Dorne sought to weaken the Lannisters. They might coordinate with any other force that rose against King Joffrey, but they would not openly declare for another claimant yet, unless a Targaryen with a real chance at the throne emerged. In exchange for the North's cooperation or neutrality in that event, Dorne would promise not to side with the crown if the crown moved to subjugate the North again. They could open a direct trade route by sea, exchanging Dornish wines, citrus, and spices for northern furs, timber, and metals. It would bypass the crown's ports, dealing a subtle blow to Lannister coffers. Furthermore, Oberyn hinted at the possibility of a marriage alliance, though he left it vague, referencing only my nieces or others in House Martell. Robb listened carefully. A subtle part of him bristled at the mention of a marriage alliance. He was yet unwed, but he had not fully considered the ramifications. The idea of forging a union with Dorne might be beneficial politically, but it felt rushed. He set that aside for the moment and focused on the immediate proposals. Bolton spoke in his quiet manner. Trade with Dorne would enrich the north, but the shipping routes are treacherous, especially if the crown tries to enforce blockades. Illyria Sand smiled languidly. The coastlines between Dorne and White Harbor are long, but we have cunning captains who can avoid the royal fleet. And once the Ironborn catch wind of it, they might harass the crown's ships instead of ours, if they see a profit in it. Karstark stroked his beard. If the crown extends its hand to the Vale or the Freys, we might need every ally we can get. We can't remain truly isolated. Not forever. Cailin's gaze flicked between Oberyn and Robb. Yet an alliance with Dorne might be seen by the crown as a provocative gesture, she cautioned. Are we prepared for the possibility that Joffrey or Tywin, or rather Tyrion as Hand, might attempt to punish us with new sanctions or skirmishes? Oberyn's mouth curved wryly. Let them try, my lady. Dorne has kept out invaders for centuries, and the north is vast. One wonders if they learned nothing from the last war. Robb's mind churned. A formal alliance could strengthen his position, but it risked entangling him in southern intrigues. Yet a promise of mutual defense with Dorne might deter the crown from any attempt at subjugation, especially if House Martell threatened them from the south. Combined with the Iron Islands controlling the western seas, the crown might think twice. I see merit in these proposals, Robb said slowly, but I need time to consider. The North has just concluded a devastating war. I do not wish to plunge my people into new conflicts unless absolutely necessary. Oberyn inclined his head. Take what time you need. We are patient to a point. We'll remain as your guests for a while, if you can stand our Dornish ways. Robb managed a faint smile. Winterfell's hospitality is yours. We'll treat you as well as any of our own. But I caution you that the northern winter is harsher than any southern custom. Oberyn laughed. We'll learn to endure the cold, so long as the company is warm. With that, the meeting ended. Over the next days, Oberyn and Illyria explored Winterfell, sampling northern cuisine and engaging in private discussions with various lords. The Great John offered them mead and boisterous tales of the last war. Roose Bolton was more circumspect, but they had at least one private talk, which Robb could not guess the content of. Meanwhile, Cailin and Sansa oversaw courtesy arrangements, ensuring the Dornish retinue did not freeze or starve in the unfamiliar climate. The days began to blur. Snow piled in the courtyards. Men wore heavier furs. Sansa found a moment's peace in the gods wood each afternoon, praying for Arya. Bran continued to struggle with Cr. Iptic dreams, confiding in Maester Luwin about visions of three-eyed ravens and doorways in the dark. Rickon roamed the castle with Shaggy Dog, occasionally stirring trouble until Caitlin scolded him. Robb, for his part, endured the daily demands of kingship with determination. Trade routes, treaties, the new laws for distributing winter rations, he oversaw them all. And still, the letters from the Night's Watch came sporadically, reminding him of the greater threat beyond the scope of any southern intrigue. Each new missive seemed more dire. More wildlings gathering, more sightings of unnerving things in the night. He prayed that Galbart Glover's contingent would be enough for now. At last, after a private talk with his principal lords, Robb decided on a measured step forward with Dorne, a pact of non-aggression and mutual defense only if the crown attacked either party, combined with open trade routes whenever possible. No formal alliance of marriage or offense. Oberyn accepted the measure graciously, though Robb sensed the prince had hoped for something bolder. The language was carefully written by Maester Luwin to avoid giving the crown grounds to accuse the North and Dorne of conspiracy. Still, it was a statement that neither the North nor Dorne stood alone. I have no illusions, Oberyn told Robb. Dorne cannot overthrow King's Landing by itself, nor do we truly want that. But we do want to see Tywin Lannister pay for my sister's murder. You'll find no sympathy for Tywin here, Robb replied. But I can't promise an offensive war. My people need time to recover. Oberyn accepted that with a nod. Fair enough. We have our own ways of vengeance. By the time we leave, At least you'll know that you have one more friend in Westeros. And that might be of some use when the snows thaw and the Game of Thrones is played again." With that, the Martells prepared to depart. They were not eager to linger in a deep northern winter. Robb threw a small farewell feast, modest compared to the coronation, but enough to show respect to their guests. Oberyn and Illyria expressed their gratitude, though they teased good-naturedly about the lack of Dornish peppers in the dishes. Before they left, Oberyn clasped Robb's hand in a firm grip. "Take care, King in the North," the prince said. "Your father was said to be an honorable man. You resemble him in many ways. Be careful not to let that honor blind you to the cunning of your enemies." Robb gave a grim smile. "I learned that lesson in war. Fare you well, Prince Oberyn. May the desert suns warm your journey." The Dornish company rode out under a sky spitting snow, their bright banners a splash of color against the white roads. Robb watched them vanish beyond the gates, thoughtful. The alliances he was forging, Ironborn in the west, a loose pact with Dorne in the south, might protect the north for a time. Yet he remained uneasy. The realm was like a patchwork of fragile truces, and if any thread was pulled, the entire tapestry might unravel into fresh chaos. Meanwhile, rumors trickled up from the south about King Joffrey's wedding to Margaery Tyrell, set to occur in the spring. That union would further consolidate Lannister-Tyrell power. Tyrion Lannister, as Hand, was apparently hard at work trying to restore the crown's finances and might yet muster a new fleet. If a second war came, it might be even more ruinous than the first. Robb prayed that the crown would be content to leave the North be. Days turned into weeks, weeks into the cusp of winter proper. Snow fell heavier, muffling the grounds of Winterfell. The white knife froze solid, and trade slowed to a trickle. Robb's nights were restless, haunted by dreams of a giant ice wall overshadowed by a swirling blackness. Sometimes he dreamed of a monstrous kraken devouring a golden lion while a direwolf stood uncertain on a blood-stained shore. Then, in the heart of winter, a raven arrived from Castle Black, marked urgent. Robb's breath caught in his throat as he recognized Galbart Glover's handwriting scrawled alongside the Lord Commander's. "We have engaged with wildling scouts near the Fist of the First Men. The wildlings are numerous, led by Mance Rayder, but that is not the worst. We have found wights, dead men that walk. We have destroyed them with fire, but they are real, your grace. The White Walkers or others are no myth. If Mance's host breaks through the wall, we will be overwhelmed. The watch begs for help. Winter is upon us, and we are too few." Robb felt the blood drain from his face. He read it twice, thrice. This was not some rumor from a half-mad deserter. This was Glover's first-hand account, supported by Jeor Mormont. The worst fears of old tales were confirmed. The dead walked, and the others stirred. If they moved south, not just the north, but all of Westeros could be imperiled. He read the last line again, heart pounding. "We beg for help." He found himself standing, the letter clenched in a white-knuckled grip, gray wind growling at his feet as if sensing the dread radiating from his master. He glanced at the windows, snow piling on the ledge, the sky a hazy iron color. The final lines burned in his mind. The White Walkers or others are no myth. If Mance's host breaks through the wall, we will be overwhelmed. This was the threat that overshadowed crowns, thrones, and petty squabbles over gold. The dead. The realm needed to unite, but the realm was shattered and suspicious. The crown would never believe him, or if they did, they might not care until it was too late. Perhaps Stannis would understand, or perhaps not. Balon Greyjoy wouldn't stir unless there was profit in it. Dorne might lend some aid, but they were so far south. The war for the living was at the doorstep of the North, and the North would have to answer. He bowed his head, closing his eyes. The vow of every king is to protect his land, his people. This threat was greater than any Lannister or Baratheon. If the dead came, if the others advanced, no single kingdom could stand alone. Yet the duty fell first to him. He was the king in the north. The wall had been built by the first men and the children of the forest thousands of years ago to guard against this very menace. Now the north was all that stood in the path of a resurrected nightmare. The weight was crushing, but he could not yield. When he opened his eyes, resolve filled them. He summoned Maester Luwin and called for his lords. A new call to arms would be issued. Men from every corner of the north must rally, not to fight Lannisters or to wage conquest, but to defend the realm of the living at the wall. They would need every sword, every dragonglass dagger, and every scrap of knowledge about how to fight the others. The fleeting illusions of peace shattered in that moment, replaced by the grim reality that the greatest war had yet to begin. Cailin found him in the solar shortly after, reading the letter again. Her face paled as he explained the contents. "The others," she whispered. "Old Nan's stories all real?" He met her gaze. "Real enough to kill us all if we do nothing." She set her jaw, tears glistening in her eyes. "Then we'll fight. We'll gather the banners. We'll do whatever must be done." Robb pulled her into a fierce embrace, holding onto her warmth. "I promise to protect the north," he murmured. "Whatever the cost." The horns of Winterfell sounded that evening. Ravens took flight in all directions, carrying the king in the north's summons. In the name of ancient oaths, every house was to send men to the wall, to stand against the coming darkness. Word would spread that the king in the north called for a new alliance of all living men, if any would heed him. Their swords were needed not for petty squabbles, but for the survival of humankind. And so the story took a new turn. The War of the Five Kings had ended in the west with the lion brought low by the wolf and the kraken. The realm had been carved into separate kingdoms, forging fragile truces and uncertain alliances. Yet, in the end, it was not mortal crowns that threatened the living, but the age-old terror stirring beyond the wall. As Robb Stark gazed at the flickering flames in his hearth, the direwolf crown upon his head, he knew that the real war was only beginning. A war that would demand more than cunning or alliances. It would demand unity, faith, and a courage beyond anything he had ever known. Let Balon hold the western seas. Let Tywin brood in his battered stronghold. Let King Joffrey preen upon the Iron Throne. North of the Wall, an ancient evil awakened. And Robb Stark, king in the north, knew that if winter truly came with the others at its vanguard, the living would have no choice but to stand together or perish as one. The old gods bore silent witness in the heart tree, and the swirling snow beyond Winterfell's gates whispered a truth older than any crown. Winter was coming, and so were the dead. Only time would tell if the scattered kingdoms of Westeros could set aside their feuds in time to face the storm.